Okay, hello everyone. So thank you for joining us for the book symposium on ethics, emotion, education, and empowerment by Leaf Kretz. The program is actually online, but we're going to begin today with Leaf giving us a little preface of her book, of their book. And then we'll move on to Mercy, will be our first commentator, Mercy Corredor, and then Eric MacTaggart, and then Elizabeth Whiting. Unfortunately, Crystal Brown is not going to be able to join us today. So we'll just leave that time open for, flexibility of going over or Q&A session. If we can all hold our questions and so on and so forth and further discussions for the Q&A session, that would be great. And Leaf, if you'd like to go ahead and start, take us away. That'd be great.
I wanted to start with saying thank you, Cecilia, for setting all of this up. I know all of the time and energy that went into preparing it, and the fact that you all read my book and prepared comments. I'm in deep gratitude to all of you, so thank you for that. I also wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. So this text was composed while living on Turtle Island and the unceded land of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, in what is currently colonially referred to as Canada. More specifically, I live in what is currently colonially referred to as Kingston. So the book begins with a quote from Helen Sissu: "The future must no longer be determined by the past. I do not deny that the effects of the past are still with us, but I refuse to strengthen them by repeating them, to confer upon them an irremovability, the equivalent of destiny. Anticipation is imperative." Dominant forms of teaching, philosophy in the West, have been strongly determined by past methods. Though our origins certainly shape us, moving forward reflectively and choosing next steps with intention allows us to consciously shape the future. I hope that the future of Western philosophy is one that fully reflects the profound role of emotion in human life and the essential role it plays in ethical pedagogy and ethical action. During the decade that I was a full-time philosopher working in academia, I was acutely focused on how to stop the repeating and limiting patterns that replicate oppressive relations. I wondered what fresh newness could enter if we opened the window to radically alternative ways of being in relationship with each other that do not include domination. I imagined, along with Jana Rosales, part of the work involves opening our hearts. The living, beating hearts of ourselves and our students have not had much opportunity to be centered in Western academic, analytic philosophy and associated pedagogies. But it is heart that contributes to cultivating the emotional capacities required for ethical action, including action that grows from the awareness of ethical harms through the lens of analytic Western ethics. The power of emotion that dwells within heart space can only manifest healthily if it's nurtured and cultivated. The argument of the book was made in part to make a case for cracking the window open, even just a little bit, to let some of that fresh air of living with heart in. In the effort to narrow down the focus and to make things more manageable, both for myself and the reader, I focused on 6 questions, all of which are constellations oriented around the question of the relationship between reason and emotion in ethics, teaching, and experience. Granted, the entanglement of these questions does not facilitate discrete boundaries. Nonetheless, each chapter takes 1 or 2 as the foci. So here are the first 2 questions. Does taking an ethics course encourage students to actually be more ethical? Does thinking about ethical systems result in significant positive behavior change? So those are the 2 questions. Chapter 1 discusses the current state of affairs. In dominant standard philosophical university ethics courses in the West, there is a tendency to teach ethical theory and perhaps apply those theories, but when it comes to facilitating action, little, if any, support is provided. Ethics is taught within the dominant philosophical tradition, focused largely on theoretical study and excludes emotional engagement. Unfortunately, acts of abstract reasoning alone do not provide fertile ground for behavior change. So next question, how do you bridge theory to action? Chapter 2 concentrates on the theory-action gap, an age-old conundrum indicating the gap between espoused beliefs and the behavior that would reflect those beliefs. The operating underlying assumption of many teaching methods tends to be that once one has new knowledge, an attitudinal shift will occur and a change in behavior will follow suit. Unfortunately, this is not what empirical research shows currently in terms of how humans operate. Reasoning about various philosophical theories so as to provide good ethical reasons for doing X instead of Y does not necessarily translate into ethical action. Various theorists postulate emotion as the primary driver of moral action, while some suggest moral reasons are provided post hoc. Moreover, solely or primarily rationalistic accounts of ethical behavior are unable to account for the operations of the unconscious. For example, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this research regarding the operations of bias. Granted, the relationship between reasoning and morality is a contested one, but it would be unwise not to tend to the fact that the bulk of evidence points to the state of affairs being such that a change in one's rationally held position does not of necessity result in behavior change consistent with that position. Human psychology is still such that without the impetus emotion provides, often we do not act on the best of reasons. So, why do dominant forms of teaching philosophical ethics focus on reasoning skills to the exclusion of emotional skills? And I do think that there's a history going on here, and that context helps us to make sense of why people respond so strongly and so negatively to emotion in the West. In Chapter 3, relationships between ethics, education, and emotion are centered. I detail the ways in which emotion is currently necessarily present in classrooms in spite of the fact that it is simultaneously undermined, undervalued, and outright dismissed. Emotion has long been devalued in the West due to the value hierarchical reason-emotion dualism. This dualistic construction makes impossible seeing the multiple epistemic functions of emotion. Emotion and knowledge do not come apart in human experience. Various ways emotions have been socially constructed are explored, and special attention is given to emotions like empathy, sympathy, and compassion in moral life. All of this translates into a ground for exploration of emotion in the classroom through the lens of affective pedagogy. Emotions are always already operative in the classroom. Failing to recognize the many ways in which they function detracts significantly from student learning. You can imagine the difficulty with which a distraught student can absorb information. Because ethics and emotion are necessarily entangled, a closer analysis of individual emotions operating in particular ethics classroom contexts can help inform pedagogical decisions. To this end, the next chapter looks at hope within an environmental ethics classroom case study. Emotion is always already playing a role in the classroom. As such, it is crucially helpful for educators to know what that role is and ensure it facilitates learning, including possibilities for students to enact their considered beliefs. Importantly, the student action I make a case for supporting is the student's own considered values and beliefs, as opposed to, say, those the instructor takes to be ethically correct. And the next question is, what happens when you explore serious ethical problems in a classroom without adequately attending to the emotional impact of learning about and focusing on such problems? So Chapter 4 provides this case study that is illustrative of how emotional concerns in the context of climate change impact the capacity to act, especially to act in ways that are consistent with one's beliefs and values. Students can become anxious, overwhelmed, and depressed when encountering the difficult topics often addressed in ethics classes, all of which can detract from learning and empowered action. Specifically, this chapter contends facilitating hope in the classroom supports positive action in the context of climate change. The concept of hope I advocate is one based on actual states of affairs, with justified hope being based on the probability of the hoped for thing coming into being. Hope is thus distinguished from adopting an optimistic or rosy attitude, regardless of the state of affairs one is facing. Hope, an emotion, a contagion, can be transmitted through teaching. Hope grows through the scaffolding of communities of hopeful persons, amplifying what can be accomplished. Given that emotions are catchy, communities of hope operate like ripples spreading out on still water. The multiple concrete benefits of nurturing hope are outlined, which include enhanced well-being and increased capacity to reach goals. Acting hopefully also works to change the horizon of what it's reasonable to hope for in the future. Each hopeful action that is enacted has implications for future possibilities. The present seeds the future. Activities and assignments for nurturing hope and empowering students within an environmental ethics course are included in the appendix. And the last question, how do you teach being ethical? Chapter 5 focuses on concrete recommendations for structuring classrooms and assignments to support the cultivation of moral change in the world, change that the students themselves have identified as consistent with their own reflectively held beliefs and values. Methods for emotional engagement to support positive action and empower students to believe in their capacity to positively transform the world are introduced. Topics addressed include active learning, how to teach hope, role-playing, empathy, sympathy, emotional intention and awareness, action projects, activating imagination, moral exemplars, character and selfhood, and emotion as a tool of resistance. Academic Western philosophy has historically proven resistant to change. BIPOC folks and women are still woefully underrepresented in terms of demographics in this profession. It's unfortunately unsurprising how the reason emotion dualism is currently operative. For those of us who recognize the role of wisdom afforded through emotion as foundational to learning ethics as wisdom afforded through reason is, the time is long past for rethinking dominant forms of ethics education. Thank you.
Leith, you are currently at Queen's University, Kingston, working on your second PhD, right? So thank you for that great summary of your book. We're going to move on then to Mercy Corredor, who is at University of Michigan for our first commentary. Mercy?
Great, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Do y'all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good, okay. All right. And all right, we'll get started. First, thank you so much to Leif for writing such a great book. I really enjoyed engaging with it. And thank you, Cecilia, for organizing all of this. Okay, so here's the outline for the talk. I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of an overview of some of the parts I found most exciting and plausible and valuable in Leif's or in Kretz's, I'll go by Kretz, I'll use Kretz for the duration of the talk, in Kretz's book. And I'll do that by focusing on a distinction that I'm introducing, and that's between active and abstract moral teaching, and which I think maps onto some of the discussion in the first few chapters of Kretz's book. Then I'll articulate what I think is the substantive disagreement I have with Kretz, and that has to do over how to think about the concept of hope and how to define hope, and in particular, how to think about hope with respect to the rationality of the emotion. And then in the third section, I'm going to motivate why what I'm doing in section number 2 matters. And so I'll get us to think a bit about how we think about hope and how we define hope matters. And I'll do so by introducing a sort of case study, which I'm calling the worry of nefarious hopes, or a test case for Kretz's view of hope. Okay, so to get into what Kretz is up to, we can think of abstract moral teaching as a type of moral teaching that instructors engage in, which primarily aims at moral knowledge. Okay, so an instructor who engages in abstract moral teaching, who practices abstract moral teaching, when constructing their syllabi or lesson plans or curriculum more broadly, they might have the students ask or questions like the ones I have outlined here. So questions like, what does it take for an action to be right or wrong? For some problem X, ought one perform some particular behavior Y? For some problem Z, what duties does one have? Okay, so that's abstract moral teaching, which is aiming at developing a particular set of moral knowledge in one's students. Now contrast that with what I'm calling active moral teaching, which has as its primary aim getting students to modify and in some way better their moral actions and behaviors. So this might include developing some moral knowledge, but it isn't just developing knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's developing knowledge for a particular end, where that end is one of improved moral action and behavior. So an instructor who engages primarily in the active moral teaching mode, they might be disposed to ask the following questions of their students. Things like, how do we go about changing our behaviors to actually become better people? And what is currently getting in the way of my doing the morally right thing? And how do I bring my behaviors in line with my considered beliefs? What precisely should I do today, next week, next year to make the world a better place? Okay. So Kretz notes that ethics courses at present are primarily centered around abstract, not active moral teaching. So ethics courses today are not sufficiently, on Kretz's view, concerned with actually changing students' ethical behaviors and actions. And Kretz cites some data to this end. So the study that Kretz cites shows that out of 40 ethics professors surveyed across 11 British and American universities, 73% of participants thought that moral reasoning could be taught. So 73% of participants thought that abstract moral teaching was a decent way to engage in the practice of ethics instruction. 40% believed that moral improvement and character development could not be taught. So 40% are highly skeptical of active moral teaching. And 40% believed that taking a class in moral philosophy could or does make some students better persons. Okay. So it seems like many ethics professors believe that ethical behavior cannot be taught, and so that the role of the ethics instructor is not to actually engage in what I'm calling active moral teaching. To this, Kretz gives a debunking story of sorts. They say, look, the reason ethics professors believe that ethical behavior cannot be taught is because they have the wrong set of tools in their pedagogical toolkit. They have the tools of abstract moral teaching. If only they had the tools of active moral teaching, then they would recognize that actually ethics instructors can change their students' behaviors. Not only does Kretz think that changing behavior requires active, not abstract moral teaching, but they think that in order to do this well, to actually get their students to change their behaviors via active moral teaching, you also have to attend to students' emotions. You know, some emotions. So an example that Kretz gives, which I really love, is that if a student is left in a state of despair, they're much less likely to actually go out into the world and change it or strive to change it than if they're left in a state of hopefulness or inspiration. Okay, so I'm happy to spot absolutely everything that has so far been argued and presented. As I mentioned at the beginning, this project strikes me as not just super plausible, but also extremely valuable. I'm convinced that ethics instructors, by and large, don't currently teach to get their students to change their behaviors and become better moral persons. I'm also convinced that ethics instructors should aim for this. And I'm also convinced that doing so is likely going to require being much more cognizant of students' emotional experiences in the classroom than ethics instructors currently are. Okay. So I've laid out all of the things that Kretz and I agree on. Now I'm going to jump to some of the things I think, or the primary thing we disagree on, and that has to do with hope. And as I started to mention earlier, the reason hope matters ultimately, it's about to get a little like theory heavy. So I just want to provide a reminder for why this ultimately matters. And we're going to come back to this at the end. But ultimately why hope matters is because in the context of instructors actually getting their students to feel hopeful, right? That's kind of the context that we have in mind when we're thinking about hope. But I'm going to zoom out for a bit and think about hope a bit more abstractly for a second. Okay, so the standard view of hope is one on which hope minimally consists of two parts. First, a desire for some outcome, and second, a belief that such an outcome is possible, though not certain or necessary. Okay, so an example, I hope for it to be sunny tomorrow. I have the desire for it to be sunny tomorrow because I would like to go for like a nice long walk. And I have the belief that it's possible. After all, it's like only overcast outside right now, and it was sunny yesterday, and it's spring. So I think it's possible that it's going to be sunny, though it's not certain. I haven't checked like the weather forecast, and God hasn't come down and told me, whispered in my ear, an angel hasn't whispered in my ear, it's definitely going to be sunny tomorrow. So it seems like I have a hope that it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Okay, so Kretz and I both agree that 1 and 2 hold, that hope minimally consists in these 2 things. Where I'm disagreeing with Kretz is on this 3rd component that Kretz builds into their definition of hope. And the 3rd component says that the belief that hope is based on must be a justified belief. So this, what we're talking about in number 2 here, a belief that an outcome, that a desired outcome is possible. For Kretz, it's not okay for it to be just any belief in a desired outcome's possibility. Rather, that belief has to be justified. So in Kretz's words, they say, hope involves a world mapping justified belief in the possibility of achieving the hoped for goal. So in other words, to just state the claim again, for Kretz, hope requires that one have an underlying justified belief in the possibility that some desired outcome will actually come into fruition or existence. Okay. My worry is that this is an unnatural and too strong a use of hope. So imagine that I recently read an obviously unreliable piece of propaganda that argued that world hunger would soon be a thing of the past. I might, on the basis of having consumed this content, form the hope that we will, say in the next 6 months or so, solve world hunger. Still, the underlying belief is clearly unjustified since I didn't do my epistemic due diligence. I ought to have known better than to have trusted this particular source. I should have sought out competing sources, etc. It's an unjustified belief that the hope is based off of. And yet it strikes me, though not Kretz, that I am hoping in this case, that just because I formed a belief in the possibility of the outcome in an unjustified way, that it doesn't strike me that that enough means that I'm not hoping. It seems perfectly intuitive and a natural use of the word hope that I am hoping in this case, even though the belief is unjustified. So I think there are other examples that make a similar point. So imagine long ago, let's stipulate 1880, people had the hope that we would come up with a cure for cancer. It's plausible that 1880 is long enough ago that people couldn't have had a credible notion of the possibility of a desired good, namely curing cancers, coming into existence. Maybe it was so long ago that they couldn't have had justification for the underlying belief. In other words, they couldn't be justified in believing that that the desired outcome was possible, because it was so long ago that science just hadn't made the advancements that could serve to justify the belief in the desired outcome's possibility. And yet, I think people in 1880 could and did hope for a cure for cancer. Similarly, you might want to say something about what's going on with respect to prison abolitionists today. It's possible that the details of what it would look like to actually succeed in abolishing prisons aren't worked out enough for us to have justified beliefs, a justified belief that such a hope or that such an outcome is possible, right? Because the details just aren't there. So we just might not be justified today in forming the belief in the outcome's possibility that it is possible for us to one day abolish prisons. And yet that doesn't seem to screen off the possibility that today we really can and do hope for abolitions of prisons. Okay, so what I think these examples show is that hope does have the potential to leap ahead of presently available evidence, and that Kretz's use of hope doesn't permit this or doesn't capture this feature of hope. Just because we have a little extra time, I'm going to give just like one more reason or argument in favor of thinking that Kretz's use of hope is too strong. So natural uses of hope, my preferred uses of hope, which do not build justification directly into the concept of hope, they permit distinguishing between rational and irrational hopes all the time. We talk about some hopes being rational, other hopes being irrational. But if hope was necessarily rational, so if hope necessarily had this justification component as a constitutive part, then we wouldn't have a need for such a distinction. But we do have such a distinction. So that seems like some evidence that justification isn't a feature, a necessary feature of hope itself. And even Kretz makes use of the distinction between rational and irrational hopes. They say, to be warranted, hope must accurately reflect the current state of affairs. I think if you're drawing that distinction, then it doesn't seem like justification is a feature of hope proper. It seems like justification is a feature of rational hope. Okay, so maybe that's what Kretz should say. Maybe at this point, Kretz should be like, wow, you're being really nitpicky and uncharitable. I'm not actually concerned with hope. What I'm actually concerned with, and instructors teaching hope or fostering and nurturing hope in their students, what I'm actually concerned with is rational hope. So they might respond by arguing that, yeah, they're just not ultimately concerned with building justification into hope. What they're ultimately concerned with is building justification into rational hope. Okay, so I've done 1 and 2. Hopefully I've outlined the nature of the disagreement between Kretz and I. And now in this next section, I'm going to motivate why I think all this matters. First though, I need to say a little bit in the way of just like reminder or recall. So remember, active teaching is a method that instructors use and presupposes that the role of the instructor is to encourage students to change their ethical behavior, to bring their behaviors in line with their own considered beliefs. And in addition, it requires attending to students' emotions, such as hope. Okay, 2 other things to recall. Remember, we just established at the end of this last section that the way forward for Kretz, I think, is to build justification, not into hope, but into rational hope. So instructors should be concerned with nurturing rational hopes in their students. And recall also that hope minimally consists of the following 2 parts, and everyone's in agreement about this, myself, Kretz, the standard literature on hope. Hope consists of first, a desire for some outcome, and second, a belief that such an outcome is possible. So, okay, here's like, we've gotten through the bit of the recall. Now I'm going to turn to the argument. So Kretz is concerned with asking about 2's rationality, right? Recall, Kretz is really concerned with 2. So 2 is a belief that such an outcome is possible, though not necessary. Kretz is really concerned with this dimension of hope, with the belief's justification, its world mappingness, its accuracy, etc. So instructors should encourage, on Kretz's view, instructors should encourage students to have the right hopes in the sense of 2, in the sense of having the right hope, in the sense that the belief is accurate with respect to predicting the outcome, the desired outcome's possibility. So what instructors should be asking themselves is this student informed enough about the possibility of the desired outcome's possibility? Okay, my question is, why stop there? Why not ask a similar type of question about 1, the desire for the outcome? Right? So Kretz is very concerned with the epistemic part of the hope, the beliefy part of the hope, and asking about its rationality, its world mappingness, its accuracy, its goodness. But why should we stop there? Why wouldn't we also ask about the goodness of the desire itself? So my thought here is, just as we can ask about whether beliefs are accurate or represent the world as it really is, we can also ask about whether values map onto, or in some sense properly track, the world or moral reality. And so if we're going to worry about what results from someone who's unjustified in believing that some outcome is possible, as Kretz does, we should also worry about what results from someone who is irrational in virtue of having a morally bad desire. So we can ask the same type of question. Does the hoping agent get the hope right? Not just about the underlying belief, but also about the underlying desire. That's what I propose we do. That's kind of where we're headed. Okay, so imagine a student who on the first day of class, unfortunately, has a budding nefarious hope. They hope that gay marriage will be outlawed in the coming years. We can even stipulate sadly, with not much need for the stretching of the imagination, that this hope is based on a justified belief regarding the possibility of the outcome, right? So with respect to 2, it's a justified belief. Okay. So, and the reason for this is, I don't know, let's build it in a bit more. Like, having recently learned that Roe v. Wade may soon be overturned, the student comes to believe that it is now more possible than ever that the court might rule similarly in other like big ticket issues. Okay, my question is, would an instructor's inculcating furthered hope in this student count as a success for Kretz? Should Kretz say that instructors in these cases where they have students with nefarious hopes, should instructors be comfortable nurturing and furthering their hope? Or is it only particular hopes that instructors should be keen to further? Okay, as I see it, there are 2 options. Either Kretz says, no, nurturing such a nefarious hope is not a success, or they say, yes, nurturing such a hope is a success. Okay, so let's look at what happens when we take each option. And yeah, okay, so option 1. In response to such a student, an instructor should not nurture just any hope that they have willy-nilly. Certainly, an instructor should not nurture that hope, the hope to outlaw gay marriage, since it is a bad hope. Now, it's not bad with respect to the belief part, as we said, but it is bad with respect to the desires part. Desiring to outlaw gay marriage is just a bad desire. So on this approach, we say, no, nurturing such a nefarious hope is not a success. What are some benefits to this? Well, the benefits are kind of clear. It has some intuitive appeal. It shields instructors from nurturing hopes that are in some sense irrational because based off of a morally bad desire. And it stymies the risk of making the world a worse off place by keeping students from acting on these nefarious hopes. The cost, however, is, as far as I can tell, something like value neutrality. It comes at the cost of giving up value neutrality, which is an especially important value for Kretz, for whom the role of the ethics instructor is to, quote, encourage students to enact their own personally held ethical beliefs, beliefs that reflect the students' own philosophical reflection. But what grounds would an instructor have, what value neutral grounds would the instructor have to not further these sorts of nefarious hopes, but that the instructor thinks that they are bad hopes from the instructor's point of view, right? They just don't align with what the instructor thinks are the right hopes to have. The student shouldn't, from the instructor's point of view, hope to outlaw gay marriage. Rather, the student should hope to make sure that that law stays in place. Okay. Maybe, however, you think that giving up on value neutrality isn't so bad. Maybe you think something like, look, instead of feigning value neutrality about the goals we have for our students, what they take away from the class, how they act, and who they become, we should wear our value-laden goals on our political sleeve. We teachers, no matter how hard we try to encourage our students to become their own people, cannot but communicate in all sorts of ways, in subtle ways, not so subtle ways, inadvertent and conscious ways, facts about our political preferences and outlooks. So in the same way journalists can't really be value neutral, teachers also can't be value neutral. Moral teachers, we are moral agents too. So maybe giving up on value neutrality isn't all that bad. Maybe we should just own it. That's option 1. Option 2 says, yes, nurturing such a nefarious hope actually is a success, even if that's unintuitive. So on this view, even students who arrive and come to the class at morally and politically bad considered moral judgments, they too should be encouraged and empowered to execute their political aims, whatever those may be, by being made to feel more hopeful and empowered to actually act on those hopes. What are some of the costs of this? Well, these are obvious. The costs here are obvious. It encourages instructors to nurture bad hopes, which in turn risks making the world a worse place, right? But there are also benefits to this strategy. It is unapologetically value neutral. It encourages students to foster their own hopes. And In some ways, it might even recognize that moral learning is an active process. It's a process that zigs and zags. It kind of like presupposes a view on which maybe we have to meet students where they are right now if we hope for them to get to where we want them to be down the line. And maybe that'll mean them going backwards for a moment with respect to making progress. But perhaps that's what's necessary for them to ultimately end up where we want them to be. And I don't have a view on whether Kretz should take option 1 or 2. I really do think that both of these options have their strengths and their weaknesses, and I haven't sorted out what I think about them. But that's where I am. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercy. So gave us a lot to think about, and hopefully we'll have a really lively conversation during the Q&A as well. I know we're running a little bit over in time, but no worries for those of you who have joined us late, because the times are going to kind of shift and we're leaving some flexibility open. Okay, so our next speaker is Eric MacTaggart from the University of Illinois at Chicago.
All right, thanks. Just gonna, okay. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to start off by thanking Cecilia for putting together this event, and thank Leaf for their book. I learned a lot, and it will certainly shape my teaching in the future, and raises a lot of big questions. So Kretz builds a strong case for their view that moral emotions like empathy, compassion, sympathy, and hope play an essential motivational role in moral action and bridge the gap between reasoning and action, whereas despair and anxiety are disempowering. A related and central view held by Kretz is that if a college ethics instructor wants to support students being more ethical, then they must adequately attend to emotions in their classes, in addition to covering philosophical theories in ethics. However, Kretz spends far less time discussing who should take on the goals of behavioral change and teaching for emotion in the first place. The question of what goals teachers should set their courses is important both for philosophers of education and practitioners. The topic of who should teach for emotion and ethical action is also worth further exploring right now for a couple of reasons. So first of all, there are passages in Kretz's book that point to some conflicting views on this matter. So sometimes Kretz suggests that all ethics courses ought to teach for emotion and moral action, but elsewhere they explicitly state that they are not making the claim that all ethics courses should have such goals. And the second reason is that exploring this tension illuminates underdeveloped aspects of Kretz's account, and it expands in fruitful ways the dialogue about supporting ethical action. So first, I'll discuss in more detail the two conflicting views held by Kretz and how one of them supports what I call a division of labor arrangement among a group of teachers or other professionals. While Kretz only briefly considers a division of labor in their book, I will illustrate how taking this arrangement seriously both reveals a way to modify Kretz's view that resolves the tension, and it helps us better understand a possible way to support ethical action. A division of labor also suggests an explanation for why many philosophical ethics teachers have focused their efforts on developing moral reasoning rather than on emotion. Okay, so when Kretz introduces their central conditional view, they also explicitly make a related and important qualification, what I call Kretz's qualified view. They are not arguing that all ethics instructors need or ought to teach for emotion and moral action. Rather, Kretz seems to suggest that each student attending college who does take philosophical ethics courses should at some point have at least one course that does teach for emotion and ethical action. So why does Kretz state that they are not arguing that all ethics instructors need or ought to teach for emotion and ethical action? They suggest a couple of reasons. So first is that each instructor will have their own unique strengths and weaknesses and teaching interests. And quote, teachers teach best and students learn best when they engage with material that moves them. Secondly, in some passages of the book, Kretz seems to leave open the possibility that traditionally taught ethics courses still lend some support for ethical action. For example, they state, quote, I contend that dominant philosophical pedagogy in the realm of ethics repeats patterns in which students learn theories but are not given sufficient tools to embody the ethical changes to which such theories point. This idea is also reflected in Kretz's point that a balance should be struck between teaching ethical theories and moral reasoning skills on the one hand, and teaching for emotion and moral action on the other. So one reason why a balance is important is that moral reasoning, quote, can be used to counteract the limitations of affective processes in our moral lives. Okay, so these 2 points that lend support for Kretz's qualified view also suggest the possibility of a division of labor. Some teachers could provide more robust support for moral action by including Kretz's emotion-oriented teaching methods in their courses, while other instructors could lend only partial support in adapting a traditional reason-oriented approach to teaching ethics. However, as a college community, they collectively adequately support moral action. So this idea of a division of labor is briefly illustrated by Kretz. They note how the University of Wyoming, got a nice picture of that right here, their hopeful thinking course could serve as a general education requirement or as a prerequisite for courses that explore heavy topics like climate change or hot button ethical issues. Furthermore, Wyoming's hopeful thinking course does not seem nor need to be a philosophical ethics course. Teaching for emotion and moral action is the focus of one course on campus, while others focus on other things. It seems that on a collective level, the University of Wyoming can educate or support the whole student and empower ethical action. However, at the end of the book, Kretz briefly discusses and rejects an arrangement that reflects a division of labor, namely an arrangement between teachers and counselors. They state that not focusing on emotion and moral action in class is constraining, debilitating, and diminishes nurturing the capacities for moral action. Earlier in the same chapter, Kretz similarly states, quote, given the crucial role emotion plays in our moral lives, the failure to adequately engage with it in ethics classes is suspect, end quote. These passages represent Kretz's strong view that all philosophical ethics teachers should teach for moral action, which includes adequately attending to emotions in their classes. But the strong view and the qualified view are incompatible. Moreover, I question Kretz's commitment to the qualification that they make early in the book. They seem to have a much stronger conviction for and ultimately lean towards this strong view. So on my reading, there seem to be a few reasons why Kretz favors the strong view. First of all, Kretz explicitly states in the introduction of the book that given the daunting ethical problems of contemporary society, college teachers have a responsibility to teach students in ways that empower them to act ethically. Second, Kretz is an advocate for comprehensive pedagogy where teachers teach the whole person. Perhaps Kretz thinks that since moral reasoning and moral emotions are intertwined in our moral lives, both should be attended to in each classroom. And third and finally, Kretz indicates that emotions of both students and instructors are necessarily present in educational environments. And so teachers need to think about, quote, how best to tend to them. Okay, so as I noted earlier, exploring and taking seriously a division of labor can help us reconcile Kretz's qualified and strong views. The first step to resolving the two is to recognize that the three reasons in favor of the strong view, which I just talked about, they can be read on two levels or in two ways. So there's the individual level and the group level. So teaching for moral action and comprehensive pedagogy can happen in a single classroom or collectively across a group of teachers or other staff. So when considering how to best tend to emotions, we can ask this question on an individual level or as a group of professionals working together. While Kretz focuses on the individual level, the division of labor sort of highlights the idea of supporting ethical actions at the group level. So with these two levels and a division of labor in mind, I propose the following modification to Kretz's strong view, which resolves the tension I described earlier, and it's this. All college students or all college ethics students should be emotionally equipped. Crucially, this does not necessarily require that all ethics teachers teach for emotion. If a college course or program equips students emotionally for empowerment, such as University of Wyoming's Hopeful Thinking course, those students can bring in those skills and tools to traditional ethics classes and other courses covering heavy topics. In studying large and complex problems in ethics courses, such students experience emotions that motivate them to act ethically, perhaps through flexing these skills or using these tools, rather than feeling depressed, disempowered, or hopeless. Moreover, in such cases, student emotions in the traditionally taught ethics classes, they are adequately addressed, albeit not in a direct way by the philosophy professor at the front of the room. Kretz's discussion of affective pedagogy supports this modification. For example, cultivating justified hope includes developing skills in goal setting, information gathering, and imaginative skills. These can presumably be brought into and exercised in various college courses. These ideas place emphasis on Kretz's brief suggestion that Wyoming's Hopeful Thinking course could be a prerequisite. On this modified view, it is important for students to be emotionally equipped before taking courses with heavy subject matter. So this idea of bringing in one's skills to different settings, which is a common phenomenon, it's all the more helpful with respect to teaching for ethical action. And this is because Kretz suggests that the goal here is to empower students in a robust sense, namely to equip them with all of the necessary tools and skills to be effective in achieving their ethical actions. A student might be emotionally motivated to act ethically and have an understanding of the relevant ethical frameworks, but not have the skills to be successful in carrying out the action. In some cases, they'll need lots of different skills, communication skills, empirical research skills, various practical skills to act effectively. So a major benefit of a division of labor is that developing all of these skills need not be taken on by one ethics teacher. It can be divided up across multiple teachers or other professionals in a way that plays to each of their strengths. So a division of labor, involves individuals in a group, each focusing on different things, and students bringing in tools and skills to these different classes. My picture of a division of labor highlights how there are different ways or types of supporting ethical action. We can distinguish between teaching that contributes to ethical action and teaching that causes or results in such action. So a division of labor involves individual teachers or other professionals, each contributing to the goal of moral action. And so a traditionally taught ethics course, they can contribute to students' ethical action, but to Kretz's point, this course does not cause or result in behavioral changes in students. So far I've highlighted some of the benefits of a division of labor. However, there are factors to consider in determining whether a certain division of labor arrangement is the best way to tend to emotions in the classroom. We need to consider the context. So one important consideration is whether one emotion-oriented course, such as University of Wyoming's Hopeful Thinking course, is enough to adequately equip students with the relevant emotional skills and tools. Kretz cites empirical studies, for example, Shu 2004, suggesting that a one-semester course can adequately equip students. However, some courses on campus are especially emotionally draining. In this case, maybe more emotion-oriented courses or teaching is needed. Also, if there are practical, financial, or administrative limitations for producing courses like Wyoming's, then Kretz's approach of ethics teachers taking it upon themselves to teach for emotion and moral action might be what is best. The latter method has its own benefits. For example, it can emphasize to students the connections between emotion and reason in their moral lives. And so the bottom line is that ethics instructors leaving it to others to provide affective pedagogy, it will not always be the best option or even an option at all with respect to tending to emotions. But even though a division of labor will not always be the best way to attend to emotions, it seems to be a promising method in some contexts. So to round out my talk, I'll briefly mention another theoretical benefit of taking seriously a division of labor, and that's it points to an explanation for why ethics instructors have tended to focus on moral reasoning rather than emotion. So, philosophers are the ones who usually teach philosophical ethics courses, and they often take themselves to be in the business of reasoning. So when these academics teach any philosophy course, whether in ethics, philosophy of language, etc., it makes some sense that they tend to focus on helping students develop reasoning skills. Given Kretz's point about teachers teaching their interests and my insights about a division of labor, it makes sense for teachers to it makes sense for students to go to professional reasoners to develop their reasoning skills. So in sum, there are good reasons to treat a division of labor as a viable candidate when considering how to best tend to emotions and support ethical action. A division of labor highlights new possibilities which teachers and researchers can test and explore. More generally, investigating a division of labor expands the dialogue about ways in which we can support ethical action. That's all I have.
Thank you, Eric. And now we will move on to Elizabeth Whiting-Pierce's commentary, and then we'll have a short break after that, and then have Leaf respond to those comments. Elizabeth?
Right. Dr. Kretz, I just want to start by saying how often I found myself talking to other educators about this book in recent months. It's come up quite frequently, and I'm grateful to have read it and grateful to have a chance to talk about my thoughts with this panel. And so thank you also, Dr. Moon, for organizing it. So today, I want to start with what I take to be Kretz's sort of highest level argument, that teaching students to be ethical means empowering students to enact their own considered beliefs. I'm sympathetic to the idea that teaching students to be ethical means that it should end in good action. And as Dr. Kretz said earlier, their motivating concern was to address the theory action gap. So recognizing that teaching students to think clearly and to reason excellently didn't necessarily lead to excellent and laudable behavior. I recognize though that that's a really big, really big, broad opening claim. And so what I want to do is argue for a more modest claim, drawing on a lot of the theoretical information from moral psychology and practices that Kretz has delivered to us in ethics, emotion, education, and empowerment. So here's my more modest thesis. And I think I treat it as a shadow thesis that is already present in the book. And I just pull a bunch of parts and pieces together in a way that I think builds that argument quite nicely. Although I hope that Dr. Kretz doesn't see that as a creative misreading. I hope it's an interpretation. So here's my claim. that teaching students to be ethical entails at least equipping students to draw on their own, on emotions, their own and others of expressions of emotions as essential but highly fallible sources of moral insight. So I think Kretz's overall emphasis is that emotion plays a central role in motivating moral behavior. And I agree with that. But before I think teachers should pursue motivating students to good action, I think there's sort of a stair step that ethics educators should attend to, and that a lot of educators who wouldn't want to pursue motivating action can attend to, and that's giving students access to emotions as an epistemic source in our moral life. So here's what I'm drawing on from ethics, emotion, empowerment, education, and empowerment to make that claim. So I think Kretz provides us many insights from moral psychology to support this account of the role of emotions as both essential and fallible sources of moral insight. And they give us numerous teaching activities that can help us equip students to attune themselves to those lessons. What I don't think the book provides, and what I try to give here, is a scaffolded pedagogy that shows what are the components of emotionally attuned ethical discernment and how might we teach them in a reasonable order so that students actually leave a class with the necessary skill set. And I think the book, it's like all there, but it has a little bit of a grab baggy feel. And I wanted to order it a little bit more clearly. Okay, so here is the argument that I am drawing from Kretz, that emotions are essential to ethical judgment. So the first is that all value judgments are at least partially constituted by an emotional experience. I think that's been argued effectively by Kretz. I imagine that this association takes that as a basic assumption. Damasio's Descartes' error, I think, has popularized the recognition that without emotions, we can't make any kind of value judgment at all. That's just a function of the way humans do decision making and make sense making in their world. So if all value judgments are constituted by emotions, and all ethical judgments are on some level value judgments, then all ethical judgments are at least partially constituted by emotion. You just can't get emotion out of ethical judgment. It isn't possible. And Western philosophy has tried over and over and over again, and it creates a lot of problems. And that's an understandable instinct, I think, because although emotions are essential to moral insight, they are also highly fallible. And that's why we try to purge them. That's why we try to be clinically reasonable, because we understand that emotions can lead us astray. And Kretz knows this. Kretz refers to the sources of emotional of error in emotional moral insight. They don't directly give us ways of dealing with those sources of error. Instead, they say, hey, look, reason is also subject to all kinds of error also, so we can't get out of the problem by turning to reason rather than emotion. We've still got the human capacity for error. But they do flag a few of those sources. So one is that we make subconscious emotional judgments, and that another is that we are inappropriately attentive to our own emotional experiences and those of our group rather than attentive to everyone who might be affected. And we just might be making emotional judgments based on erroneous beliefs about material or social realities. That's just a few. There are a lot of other ways that our emotions can mislead us. Kretz is clear that the job of an ethics instructor is therefore to help students relate to their emotions in world mapping ways. Let me see. let me look at my own notes here. So, and built into that claims that we can relate to our emotions in world mapping ways are a few of these, are a few other subclaims. One is that we improve judgment through more attention to emotion, not less. So it's not by pulling emotion out of judgment that we become more attuned to reality. It's that we can pay more attention to emotion. We can improve our judgments by attending to relevant others rather than just ourselves and the people that we identify with. This makes me think of discourse theories of democracy who are really concerned with whose opinion needs to be considered in this decision. So Shayla Ben-Habib, Jürgen Habermas, those folks have thought a lot about who needs to be brought into deliberations on a social level. I think there are similar logics at play, sort of buried in Kretz's work about who needs to be brought into consideration at an emotional level. But also, before we can do that, before we can start to attend to others' emotional reactions, we have to attend to our own emotional reactions. And that's not always easy to do. But if we can learn to do those things to bring in more emotion, not less, then emotion can start being a window into reality rather than a blinder to reality. So that's emotionally attuned ethical judgment and some of the assumptions that are baked into it. Okay, so if I were thinking about how to give my students the ability to relate to emotions in ways that improve their judgment, I would I sometimes do take them through something like these 4 steps. So the first is just to help students develop awareness of what their emotional experiences are. This is harder than it sounds. Conflict, and one of the most basic things you have to do in conflict skills is to say, how am I feeling? How might this other person be feeling? I recognize that conflict skills is not ethics education, but go with me here. It's really hard for people to answer the question, what am I feeling? Most people lack even a basic emotional vocabulary for that. So they can usually say, I feel bad, I feel uncomfortable. They stay away often from some very obvious words like I feel angry, because those are socially sanctioned. But students have to have the ability to name their own emotions before they can do a whole lot of insight. There are a lot of ways that ethics instructors can do this, although I don't think it's just ethics instructors. I think psychology professors, literature professors, there are a lot of disciplines that can give students a vocabulary of emotion that can give them awareness of emotions as a source of insight. Maisha Cherry has a great book out on anger and virtuous rage. But there's also pop psychology stuff, like Brene Brown's pretty great on giving people access to emotional vocabulary. So that's the first step. The second step, once students have an emotional vocabulary and can express their own emotions and identify them, is to help them figure out who else they should be paying attention. Like if one of the key biases that humans have is to be sort of self-centered and to group-centered, then one thing they have to do is understand what other emotional experiences are relevant to the situation at hand. There's no exact science for that. I truly think discourse democratic theory provides some ideas for whose opinions matter on that. But the basic golden rule, how would others feel if they were in your, how would you wish to be treated in this situation, can offer some guidance to whose emotional experience is relevant. Okay, so then the next step, as I would order them, there's a lot of reasonable ways of ordering these, but here's one, is to help students start to pay attention, to start gathering data, almost like they're social scientists. Like you almost want them to start thinking like ethnographers. And they can do that by directly encountering relevant others in conversation, or they can do that in mediated ways through art or literature, history, so all sorts of ways of accessing others' emotional experiences. And then last but not least, and this is the tricky part, is learning how to sift through all of that emotional data. And that in itself is a really complex process. And I'm not going to give you a magic bullet for how that should go. Although I think Kretz gives some really good insights on the importance of having communities of moral discernment and making sure that the right people, all of the relevant others, are in that moral community, and that moral community has the skills to pull out emotional insights. But in any case, it's helping students find ways to evaluate their own and others' emotional experiences for insight and also for error. Because we have to assume that just as our emotions are fallible, all other humans' emotional insights are fallible. And there's no real way of getting around that. There's no way of taking the fallibility out of the discernment process. It's just that one doesn't need to remove emotion to remove fallibility, because that comes with human reason also. So I'll leave us on that messy note. Hopefully others will have other thoughts about how to do that evaluative and constructive work. But those are the 4 stages that I would help students move through if I were to take up Kretz's project as my own, but with the more modest goal, not of leading them to ethical action, but just to leading them to ethical discernment. Okay, so why I think this is useful. I think rhetorically, this is helpful because in saying that ethical discernment comes before ethical action, I think it protects Kretz's broader project from the charge that it's encouraging energetic but unreflective action. So, which I don't think is true. I think at every stage along the way, Kretz is indicating that thoughtful engagement and responsible engagement is what ethics instructors should be promoting. But if students don't have a strong enough sense of what their own values are as achieved through careful reflection, it would be easy for a persuasive and charismatic, but very motivating ethics instructor to take up that work in a way that was ultimately coercive, which I think is part of what Mercy was trying to point out. Pedagogically, I think this is important because it gives a point of entry to people who don't feel comfortable facilitating community engaged pedagogies. Those can be expensive, they can be logistically difficult. There are a lot of reasons they can be politically charged. There are a lot of reasons one might not want to engage in that particular pedagogical style. But I really do think most ethics instructors can equip students with vocabulary of basic emotional concepts, and I think they should. To the division of labor question, I think that this should be pretty broadly, I think this should be normal. I think for ethics instructors to help people be aware of emotion, because emotion is shaping their judgment so profoundly. And then last but not least, I think attending to the role of emotion in ethical judgment, it just opens up other interesting conversations about phenomenon like ethical deliberation and practical wisdom, which I didn't come even close to addressing systematically in my paper here, but I think there are interesting little tentacles to be explored. So with that, I'll just say thank you to everybody. It's been lovely to have the last word and to get to respond to the comments that have gone before, and I will turn it over to Dr. Moon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So those are like 3 great commentaries. I think all 3 gave us a lot to think about. And now we'll turn to Lee's response to the commentators, and then we'll move on to Q&A. Lee?
Thank you. I want to thank the commentators for insightful comments and a close reading of the book. I found their comments thought-provoking, helpful for challenging the work, and helping it to grow in new directions. So profound gratitude to all of you for your lovely offerings. Okay, I'm just going to go in the order that I have them. Currently, it's not responding directly to folks in the order they spoke, but I think you can put it together. So I'm glad to hear that Eric finds my case strong for the view that moral emotions such as empathy, compassion, sympathy, and hope play an essential motivational role in moral action and bridge the gap between reasoning and action, whereas despair and anxiety are disempowering, end quote. Eric also definitely identified a potential tension within the work, namely a tension between a key claim of the book, the thesis I look to defend. I just have to pause for a second because I had to laugh because I read Eric's and there's this like secret thesis looming in the background. And then I read about my shadow. There's a shadow thesis in my work and I'm like, gosh, for an ethicist, it seems like I'm pretty dicey with all of this background operations. Okay, so Eric reaches this tension between the thesis I look to defend and my own view, a much broader view that would require a different sort of argument. This particular argument, the one in the book, takes the form of a conditional. If a college ethics instructor wants to support student and power so that they can enact their ethical beliefs, then one must adequately attend to how emotion functions in the classroom and in action. There are, I believe, in the book ingredients for making grander claims, some of which I intonate and Eric carefully wove together with comprehensive attention, but substantiating them with analytical rigor would be a different sort of thing. I'd make the case. Also, recall the window I mentioned in the introduction. Cracking open the window of traditional analytical philosophical ethics, to my thinking at the time of writing, was only to be successful through making a case for manageable steps from within the disciplinary constraints. I make a case that speaks to professors already working within the discipline and additional ethics educators who are sympathetic or curious about the project. These are ethics professors and educators who already see the worth in or are curious enough to read a book about providing an ethics education that reaches beyond theory to support students enacting their reflectively considered ethical beliefs and values. Then there is the stronger claim, which Eric carefully traces in the work. It was such a close reading, Eric, like bravo. I had my book out, I was checking pages. Thank you for that. Namely, that I think all ethics classrooms would be enriched by engaging whole students, in this case, heart and mind elements, and that the world needs more support for reflective ethics that are enacted. That in my heart of hearts is absolutely, indeed, what I believe. But I didn't experience it as a tension in my thinking or my writing as I was going along. I did tease them apart while I was writing. Rather, I conceptualized it along the lines of an argument like Peter Singer's classic article, Poverty, Affluence, and Morality, wherein Singer articulates the argument they are making, which is more contained but still impactful, while admitting they actually believed a stronger version of the argument to be true. But that was not what the argument Singer was presenting had to be about, and it would be more difficult to make that argument, I would make the case. So Eric is absolutely correct. The stronger views certainly crept in throughout the text, but those views need not necessarily detract from or be in tension with the stated argument, or at least I would make that case. As hope theory advocates, identifying small manageable steps and then building on them is an effective way to sustain hope and contribute to effective goal attainment. It certainly would have been beneficial for me to more clearly delineate between the two views, and I appreciate the attention being called to this, and I can announce this sort of position in future work. I would contend, however, there is no inherent tension in making a smaller strategic argument while having a larger philosophical view operative in the background. And I would make the case this is likely something that happens fairly often, I would guess. We're not, at least I make the case, in any one piece, we're not defending all of the views that we're bringing to that piece. We're defending the ones that are operative within that piece and should be attended to. Okay, the question Eric helpfully presents about who is to implement this emotionally aware education is a fair one. Again, writing the book is in part for folks concerned about teaching ethics generally and ethics educators working in philosophy in particular, and that this was strategic. Large-scale institutional change is slow-moving and too often takes the form of top-down approaches that sap the energy, enthusiasm, and authenticity of bottom-up approaches. There is a freedom in the classroom to pedagogically explore in ways that do not require institution-wide planning and implementation of initiatives. The approach I recommend is certainly from the bottom up and of necessity requires the authentic interest and investment of ethics teachers. This is why, although I believe our students in the world would be better off if ethics education involved cultivating emotional wisdom in student and power, I also know that unless teachers themselves believe in the merit of growing pedagogy in this direction, there'd be no meaningful uptake. This is part of my concern about the siloing with the emotion training style classes that Eric introduces through the proposed division of labor, where philosophers of ethics get to keep on primarily or solely focusing on the workings of reasoning, while counselors, teams of teachers, etc., may take on the heavy lifting of preparing students for emotionally surviving and maybe even thriving in courses that take on heavy and challenging material and further providing empowerment opportunities to world change. Now, the nature of the material in ethics courses in particular matters here. I use environmental ethics as a case study because the material is, I'm going to say indubitably, the material is indubitably difficult on an emotional level, given the scale and expansiveness of ecological destruction that is chronicled in these classes, coupled with the destruction and mistreatment of so many of our more than human kin. Eco-anxiety, for example, is a pervasive and widely documented phenomena. It's just one of the emotions that people growing up today are dealing with, new emotions related to climate change. It isn't a question of whether you can keep the emotion off to the side. It's activated by the nature of the material. Suggesting that you can learn emotional skills in one class and apply them to all future experiences is, I believe, an overly rosy approach. For one, emotional skill development, like reasoning skill development, is of necessity ongoing, and more support will be required in some classes as opposed to others. Second, you cannot extract the emotional valence in a class. It's always already operative in the class. It's up to the teacher how to identify and use this presence in the classroom. Ignoring it, I make the case, detracts from the learning possible, as affective pedagogy demonstrates, and detracts from engaged action motivated by emotions like hope. I think Eric does a very good job identifying the sorts of arguments one might give for a division of labor. I will let those stand for themselves and instead focus on the firm pushback from philosophy focusing on anything other than the central role of reasoning. I contend attempting to isolate and compartmentalize reason is far more difficult to do when we're dealing with the subject of ethics in general and environmental ethics in particular. The material covered is simply too emotionally evocative, challenging, and difficult. It is an engagement with the messy day-to-day reality of the world, a helpful outgrowth perhaps of applied philosophy. Of course, developing reasoning skills will always be a defining quality of philosophy. And of course, there are significant benefits from honing reasoning skills. I happen to think humans operating from within the Western paradigm are equally bad at reasoning and emotional skills. Both need cultivation. And here is my strong actual view. It just cannot be an either-or affair when teaching ethics, given the operations of human psychology and physiology, and not only acting, but thinking through ethical responses to moral harms. Reason and emotion do not fully come apart in humans, which operates as a nice segue to Liz's commentary. I very much appreciated the significantly differing directions the commentators took my work in. Sparking dialogue can lead to conversations where each conversational partner learns much about each other's view. It's been a privilege getting to know a little of the philosophical worlds of all the commentators. Liz's weaving of existing material into an impactful recommendation helped me to see a new way to use the material. I am, of course, sympathetic to Liz's arguments regarding emotion being necessary to moral life. I too believe our values and emotions are bound together when it comes to moral life. I agree that just because one has made a reasonable judgment, it does not mean that it is an emotion-free judgment. Indeed, one can reasonably argue all value judgments, including ethical judgments, involve emotion. Ethical action depends on emotion insofar as suffering, and specifically the alleviation of suffering, is both a guide and driver for moral action. We know this from Hume. Emotion as a prompt for a means of sustaining human action. In terms of the necessity of moral emotions for moral life, Hume provides the classic example with the exception. So this pertains only to humans who are capable of such emotions. I think that there are some humans that we don't talk about often enough when we're doing ethics who are exceptions to that quote unquote normal psychology and physiology. So Hume's classic example is that humans have the capacity for sympathy derived from our own experience of suffering. Emotional impetus is required for a person to desire one thing over another. Otherwise, we're faced with situations with multiple potential outcomes, but no indication of being drawn to one outcome over another, resulting in indifference. Empirically, a case can be made that even children, so I'm actually citing somebody who makes this case, that children don't turn away from suffering and are motivated to help. So we have that capacity. It may not be in full bloom, but the capacity for sympathetically responding to our fellow humans and more than humans is operative in seed form as part of our human inheritance, or at least the vast majority of humans. Emotions can be treated as offering helpful data. Emotions as epistemic resources are fallible, much like reason is fallible, but essential guides to moral action. Due to the pervasive operations of oppression and the accompanying devaluing of all things emotional, the role of emotion in our moral lives, when seen through the lens of academic philosophy, rarely articulates the necessary and helpful epistemic functions of emotion. Instead, emotions are often construed as subversive of knowledge, interfering with or disconnected from reasoning. And there is a coupling of emotion with irrationality. Alternatively, feminist theorists have argued emotions are essential rather than inimical to knowledge, and call attention to the fact that most emotional states are about or at someone or something. So they tend to involve judgments. A number of them involve judgments. Even when emotions are absent an object, they still involve deeply layered social meanings and matrices of belief and value. Rather than presuming emotions derail and distort perception, one can acknowledge that absent specific reasons to distrust them, emotions can be treated as initially tenable. Put differently, the operations of affective systems have prima facie defeasible epistemic justification. Emotions can be used as epistemic signposts, which tell us about ourselves and how we respond to environments. Signposts that can, granted, fail at times. But if they weren't generally of use, they wouldn't be relied upon and play such a crucial role in navigating life. Moreover, just because the capacity is not flawless, read incapable of erring, is not reason alone to dismiss it. This is all the more obvious when one considers that no human capacities are flawless. Like any capacity, training can enhance performance, refining as we go along. In the case of wise responses to emotionally derived epistemic information about the world, those responses may be enhanced by mindfulness training, therapy, and the perspective that age can afford through experience and reflection, the ability to be of what Aristotle calls the phronimoi, like the wise ones. So emotions map salience. The human affective system evolved over time, and emotions are adaptive responses generated through natural selection. Emotions are crucial for ethical discernment. If emotions didn't aptly reflect states of affairs enough of the time to be useful, we wouldn't rely on them. Emotion provides data, and that data is required to inform ethical discernment. Next, I will turn to the skills Liz mentions and build on what was said. Sorry, I turned this off. Can you hear that in the background? I've got another machine in another room ringing noises. Not my phone. I turned my phone off, so hopefully you can't hear that back there. Okay, next I will turn to the skills Liz mentions and build on what was said. First, awareness of one's emotional experience is unfortunately rare. Asking students to consider how they're feeling can create a ground for meta-emotional awareness. So I'm in complete agreement with Liz, and I'm just going to give you an example. A good example comes from Kathy Cook, who developed an exercise to help cultivate awareness through contemplative practice and first-person noting. The students note how they feel in the margins as they read material, annotating text with moments of emotional awareness, and doing so with curiosity and without judgment. One student reflecting on the exercise said that it made them conscious of what otherwise would remain unconscious, while another student recognized the influence of mood on how one reads and thinks. I appreciated this idea to introduce students to wider and more precise emotional vocabularies. And I'm a fan of Brene Brown, so bring on the Brene. I think the exercise above demonstrates a way not only to encourage emotional self-awareness, but also help students realize the emotional worlds of others. When their colleagues share some of their emotional worlds, the step is not large to recognize all perspectives have their own starting presumptions operating in the background. This should help with building the skill of identifying others' experience and whose experience matters. Identifying others whose emotions matter and ascertaining the emotional experience of others helpfully illustrates the social fabric of emotion. Emotions arise in community, differ among communities, are taught to children, and change meaning over time as cultures and society shift and grow. Meditation can be used to create the space and cultivate the loving kindness necessary for really engaging with the emotional experience of those who are not you. As Liz points out, learning how to evaluate emotional experiences, checking for accuracy and legitimacy, helpfully illustrates the role of the defeasibility condition discussed above. However, I would add when checking for emotional accuracy and legitimacy, don't be beholden to only the views of your own culture, particularly when in the position of an oppressor. And this was already gestured at by Liz in terms of talking about my tendency to really emphasize how you have to be inclusive in terms of who's involved in these discussions of meaning making. Assessing who for you are the wise folks when it comes to emotional attunement and discernment can provide models to learn from. So that's how you protect yourself from a vicious regress if you're talking about learning wisdom from others. There is, as Mercy says, a concern about feeling overwhelmed and a potential inability to act. Mercy's central worry with my count is that I fail to capture the intrinsic riskiness of hoping under unjust and other fraught social-political conditions. I think the riskiness is that one might have a student engaging in nefarious hopes, which I'll address in what follows. I should begin, though, with a hesitancy I have with virtue ethics subsuming other approaches. Mercy notes that the worry that dominant moral learning involves overly abstract engagements, absent emotional attunement and engagement, the type of moral learning is insufficiently conducive to incite improvement, unquote. Then Mercedes makes some distinctions. Sorry, Mercy, I had written that part before. Yeah, I knew you go by Mercy. Then Mercy makes some distinctions between abstract moral learning and teaching and active moral learning and teaching. In a footnote, Mercy clarifies another way to frame the distinction is in terms of the goals that each type of teaching has. Moral learning aims at knowledge, whereas active moral learning aims at action. And I would differ a little bit there. Rather, I would say moral learning takes multiple forms and seeks to grow a diversity of knowledges. Distinguishing between a form of moral learning absent emotional presence and focused on knowledge from an action-based approach in which one aims at action as opposed to knowledge is to set up a false dichotomy. I would make the case, likely after knowledge in this sort of circumstance. Knowledge and action certainly often come apart in human behavior, but they don't have to. Wisdom, I would venture, requires both understanding and action that reflects that understanding. Again, Mercy described the topic in terms of virtue, referring to the data that highlights professors of ethics within the dominant tradition primarily or, in some cases, exclusively focus on abstract moral thinking. They state that I take the data to reveal, quote, that the majority of ethics professors do not attempt to improve students' character and change their behaviors because they don't believe this can be taught in the classroom. I think there's a little bit of slippage here in the interpretation. I hope that it's clear that I'm not making a case to improve students' characters and change their behaviors. Rather, I'm making a case for empowering our students to act in ways consistent with their own collectively held beliefs and values. Mercy says changing behavior requires active, not abstract moral reasoning. But I'd make the case that both moral reasoning, abstract and applied, and adequate engagement with emotional wisdom and practical considerations of how to effectively act in the world are needed. And I suspect in this section, I might be misunderstanding some of the nuanced distinctions that Mercy made. But at least this will help clarify where my misunderstanding comes from. There is, and here's another like bear my heart moment. There is an inherent trust in students embedded in the book. I didn't state it explicitly, but it's a background assumption. I don't know what the outcomes will be, but I do believe through the work of reflecting on beliefs and values and recognizing the world need not be accepted as given, and coupling that with open minds and open hearts and beings with the capacity for compassion and sympathy, I think that the outcomes will be better than the oppressive present. If you're getting these students out in the world and acting their beliefs in the context of this wider environment that we're creating to really learn how to listen, bear witness to the experience of others, be good in relationship with others. That, I mean, the reason that I teach is I think that some students will learn, right? And I think the thing that they're learning about is particularly important. So I would hope over time. That would lead in the direction of a more inclusive world. I'm in full agreement that to teach character development, the type of character development that's needed to improve ethical behavior, instructors need to be more mindful of how their classes impact students at the affective level. But I also want to be careful again about not reducing ethics to character development. Mercy worries about the case study that I used to motivate attending to emotional dimensions of hope, how emotion is activated in an environmental ethics course, and the importance of hope as an emotion to empower action. In particular, they worry that my analysis of hope, which includes a world mapping component, neglects natural uses of hope, where hopes are premised on unjustified beliefs. Again, I'd articulate my position a little differently than Mercy does. If someone fails to do due diligence to assess the probability of the hoped-for thing coming into being, then they are resting their hopes about the future on a false articulation of the current state of affairs. What Mercy calls hope, I would call wishful thinking. So that's the distinction I would make there. We can talk about it more during the question period. So what Mercy calls hope, I would call wishful thinking once the connection is broken between what is happening and mapping the world in a way that reflects what is happening. Then it isn't what we would refer to as a justified hope. I think wishful thinking captures that better. To say that is not to say that sometimes very unlikely outcomes might be hoped for, but the intensity of the hope should reflect the probability of the outcome. Justified hopes are based on successfully world mapping. Otherwise, it would be unattached from the world, right? This is like an epistemic aid. So yes, justified hopes are based successfully on world mapping. You could choose to define hope differently, but the working definition I use is based on what hopeful people do. So using the work of Charles Snyder, which is to assess the world, attempt in action in the direction of a hope for a goal, and then recalibrate as needed. The recalibration may be in terms of improving understanding of the current state of affairs. I will pause here for a second. Like, I really appreciated this concern that too much is achieved definitionally by saying justified, by planting that right in there. And it took years for it to take that shape. The bigger question for me is not whether we would call it hope or not, but whether the thing I'm calling hope, whatever you want to call that, how is that operating in the classroom? How is that operating in our moral lives? I'm happy to quibble about definitions, but the larger question for me just has to do with how we're approaching things and how it would be beneficial to take a different approach potentially. Mercy says, surely we can hope for outcomes even when we were careless in how we went about forming our beliefs about that outcome's possibility. But again, I would say this is a wish as opposed to a justified hope. Perhaps Mercy would refer to some hopes as being groundless, but still hopes. I would respond that given my usage of the term, if something is groundless, it is wishful thinking. If it is guaranteed not to happen, hope is not needed. Or excuse me, if it's guaranteed, hope is not needed, you have certainty. Hope on my account occurs between these two extremes of having no understanding of the probability of this thing coming into existence and having complete certainty. And that's not to say that you can have, low amounts of hope, because the current state of affairs is what it is. But I also think it's important to introduce this idea of imagination. I actually have a piece on this where I talk about how what you're doing today fundamentally shapes what it's reasonable to hope for tomorrow. So I hope that that helps get us further along. Okay, so I went into my own little digression and I write about it next. Here we go. That being said, I've also written about the imagination and its relationship to hope. The justified hope criterion is not meant to unnecessarily limit, rather it's a pragmatic encouragement to make sure you are clear about the existing state of affairs so as to best position yourself for engaging in compassion-enhancing behaviors. I appreciate Mercy's concern that we shouldn't build justification into the definition of what it is to hope. But pragmatically speaking, assessing whether one is justified to hope based on the outcomes possible is not to build justification into the definition so much as to capture a sense of how humans hope when they hope well. And to distinguish this from likely impossible outcomes. All that is needed for a hope to have an iota of justification is for it to have an above zero possibility of happening. We can temper our hopes in relation to the world responses to our behavior, thereby enhancing the probability of success through engaging in actually world mapping activities. As stated, the viability of hope rests on its justifiability through being successfully world mapping, which I distinguish from wishful thinking. I would also need more additional convincing that wishful thinking and delusional thinking are related. In here, God are the same thing, but are related in the way that Mercy is thinking about. I think perhaps the disagreement is a difference of preferred definitions. Mercy presents the notion of a student with nefarious hope, and that the hoped for thing is premised on a world mapping justified belief of the possible outcome. I would need to hear more about the jump to one who is irrational in virtue of having a morally bad desire. Nefarious hope suggests a negative intention when one need not. Just because someone else's hopes are not in the direction you would prefer doesn't make them necessarily nefarious. Indeed, I would suspect the anti-gay marriage student has numerous reasons for holding their view, none of which need to be malicious. I don't know about your classes, but I encourage a lot of non-malicious people who are participating in systems of oppression. I think we are all learning as we go along, and we can grow in health when introduced to new ideas in compassionate ways. Maybe at one moment one believes in one direction and the next believes in another. But if an open-hearted and open-minded approaches the foundation and it seeks to reflect existing conditions, then we are better positioned on my analysis for the future to be more moral. Students can learn about themselves, their beliefs, whether they're justified, and so on, in a forum where students are actors capable of changing the world when given the supports to do so. Empowering our students to feel their power, to not just be in the world, but change it, and supporting this in the context of a class, I think will over time help us moving in a more just, more caring, more humane way. But I'm neither value neutral nor positive I know all the right answers. I'm interested in learning with students as we go along, correcting and revising and evolving as needed. I accept as given, I hope not controversially, that oppressor-oppressed relations are immoral. Insofar as a behavior works against oppression, it moves in the direction of a less oppressive world. Thinking, feeling, open, supported students who are empowered to engage in the world and changing it, whatever their beliefs might hold at that moment, are better positioned to, once they're introduced to multiple perspectives in the context of the classroom, that cultivates this sort of open-hearted, open-minded approach. As Mercy points out, all moral teachers are moral agents coming from a particular perspective and political outlook, so they are not value neutral. And I do recommend transparency with students. Interestingly, there's studies that show, so you can have somebody who is very intentionally going into a class and not talking about their beliefs and values. And they're doing this in one class, and then in another class, they're talking about their beliefs and values. And what the study showed, this is an old study, I'd have to dig it up, but what it showed was that whether you want students to, have exposure to your beliefs or not, they are. You don't even have to verbally articulate them. The students are still picking it up. So I really do think it's important to not only be clear about your own beliefs and values with yourself, but to be clear with your students as well, and to notice where biases might pop in. My view is premised on relations of trust between teacher-learners, and I'm in agreement that we must meet our students where they are and learn from their positionality as much as we learn from our own. In closing, I would like to leave off with a vision of future research and writing that grows from the work I did in ethics, emotion, education, and empowerment, which I will now have to refer to as E to the power of 4, because I read it. In the methodological consideration section in chapter 1, I suggest that important and necessary work for rethinking dominant paradigms can happen both in and outside of existing traditions. The dismantling of oppression ideally is occurring everywhere at all times. While one can work within or outside of dominant norms, working within them requires recognition of the limitations of such an approach. And I refer readers to Audre Lorde's work through a citation, and it's "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And in this book, I'm making a case for working within. Working within can generate immediate change by folks in positions of significant power, for example, professors. But if one is consistently working within the system, one cannot dismantle the system, because by your activity, you're propagating it. Working outside of the tradition involves centering marginalized philosophies, ontologies, epistemologies, and peoples. Indigenous pedagogies in the Anishinaabe tradition, for example, are designed such that the cultivation of emotion-based wisdom is essential, embedded, and embodied. You don't have to introduce it as something extra because it's already there. It's never been pulled out and just had reason focused on in isolation. There are traditions where the theory-action gap does not manifest because theory and action are not thought of, experienced, or treated as separate. The theory-action gap is an outgrowth of dominant Western epistemology and ontology. If we started with alternative epistemologies and ontologies, the problem need never arise, or may take a different and less vexing form. If Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, and axiologies on Turtle Island were the most predominant, the ecological harms we are now facing couldn't have arisen, given the land-based education and the cultivation of respect and reciprocity for a more than human kin, including parent of all, Earth. After writing the book, I realized I had put all that energy into attempting to shift the disciplinary constraints of analytic philosophy a little bit. As an anti-oppression scholar and activist, it occurred to me that perhaps this was not the best use of limited energy, particularly given that the world is on fire. Rather than fractionally shifting dominant disciplinary discourse, one could instead work outside the constraints of that particular discourse, thereby making space for radically different foci and alternative constellations of questions. Relatedly, I decided to permanently prop the window wide open and to let the fresh air of living with heart in through exploring a different discipline, namely education. It's a whole discipline where small strategic moves aren't needed to start to open the window a crack to the vibrant and crucial role of emotion in education. Rather, the window there has been open for many practitioners for quite some time. As a result of the move, a new and broader line of inquiry has surfaced, namely whether working within dominant institutional paradigms and discourses within post-secondary education renders radical anti-oppressive alternatives impossible by design. Rather than fighting an uphill battle tooth and nail to shift dominant discourse of fraction, perhaps, especially given timeframes we are working with regard to climate change, energy is better spent figuring out whether previous paradigms are up to the task of radical anti-oppressive change. And if not, instead of working within them, we have a strong reason to be working outside of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leaf. So we're going to move on to the Q&A, and I think what might be easier is if everybody just unmute, and then if you have questions, and then Leaf, do you want to field your own questions, or would you like me to do so?
Yeah, I would be fine with that.
To field your own questions? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless you would prefer to, in which I'm totally fine with that too.
It's Okay. So does anyone want to start off with a our first question, maybe a follow-up on Leaf's responses. I'm sure that there are people dying here to ask some follow-ups.
Rachel and Mercy after.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks to all of you for your great work. I've learned a lot and really enjoyed all the sessions today. Full disclosure, I haven't had a chance to read the entire book yet, so I'm one of those, sorry. But I want to pick up on some of the stuff that Leaf, you were talking about right there at the end, and then also Eric's question about like, who is to do this kind of work, but from a different angle, because I think that, yeah, in academia as it currently exists in like Anglo-speaking philosophy, the people who are most likely to act on your suggestions are probably marginalized philosophers along various dimensions, right? And then if that's the case, which, you know, we can talk about why that might be true if you don't have that intuition along with me. If that's the case, then we might end up reifying this reason emotion dichotomy because only a certain kind of person is engaging in these projects, and these other kinds of people miraculously never teach a course that way. And so like that's kind of a worry I have that relates to Leaf, your strong versus more moderate argument, like your strong belief and then your more moderate argument, which is like, in an ideal world, yeah, maybe everybody should do this, but in the actual world, given patterns of oppression, maybe we shouldn't even be trying to have everybody do this because some people are not going to be well suited for it given their social positioning, et cetera, et cetera. So that's like, what do you think about that, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's super important. And we always have to be mindful of the extra expectations we have of people who are in marginalized positions. So if it's the case that marginalized philosophers, and my intuition is similar to yours, I haven't done the research, but like my intuition is similar, that thinking about how that plays out within existing teaching norms, I think is an incredibly important focus when it comes to power and how power is operating. And with regard to marginalized philosophers, I just wanted to mention in the new project, I'm only interviewing marginalized faculty, talking about whether the institution is capable of changing. So I'm sympathetic to that, the epistemic view who are most harmed by existing states of affairs have really helpful information for ceasing that harm. But again, that's the responsibility, right, on those individuals. We're really seeing that at Queen's in terms of just, they're trying to pull people in, but these are folks who are isolated, who are lacking support at multiple levels, not even just associated with the school. Like if you're trans, what do you need? If you're like, how do you navigate social space? So yeah, I absolutely share your concern. Thank you for articulating that. I was jotting while you were talking. Yeah, Mercy.
So my question isn't so much, it's not a follow-up at all. I don't think it is. It's like what I would have done had I not written this set of comments, like the other idea I was toying with. And yeah, and I think you address it in the book and I'm just forgetting, but I'm just curious to hear you talk more about this experience I have not infrequently, which is that I teach issues about which I don't feel hopeful at all. So like I get in the classroom and I just feel totally deflated, and I feel that that despairing attitude is fitting in some of these cases, because I'm teaching about really pressing topics. And I'm just wondering, like, if you could say more about, like, what should we do in those cases? Like, should I ever fake it? Like, that kind of strikes me as
Oh,
weird.
that's interesting.
Like,
Yeah,
what if
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
having like a terrible semester and I'm just like
Right?
despairing all semester? Like, should I fake it ever? Or yeah, what should I do in those cases?
And that brings in questions of authenticity
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
as an individual teacher, what feels true to you in that moment. And I'll just share this with you. The reason I started the Hope research is because I was teaching depressing material over and over and over. And it wasn't just affecting the students, it was affecting me.
Yeah.
And this is just telling of my, you know how your personality creeps into everything you write? I'm like, what do we do to fix this? What are the steps? We need strategies. How do you get from theory to action? How do you support students? And it's very pragmatic, right?
Yeah.
It's very like, here's an idea, do this, try this, da 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 da. But in terms of the oh my gosh, the incredible moment we're in as humans. I mean, I meant it when I said the world's on fire. The world is literally on fire. I'm like, why am I going to classes? The world is on fire right now. But we're living in that environment, and trying to figure out how to be honest is really important. I'm doing, I just finished a primer on eco-anxiety, and one of the things we talk about in it is how important it is to validate emotions, whether they're positive, negative. And if you're feeling despair, depressed about these sorts of issues, it actually means you care to some extent, right? So eco-anxiety has two forms. One is very fruitful and gets people active, and another is not. They've started to make that distinction in the literature, which I found interesting.
And that sort of response does remind me of things Liz was saying, like with isolating the emotion, or like coming to have awareness over what the contours of the emotion are, as like a sort of first step before figuring out, like jumping into action mode and figuring out like what to do about having
Yeah, and that moment can also be a really teachable moment, in that, like, at this moment, this day, this is how I'm feeling. And in 3 weeks, it might be different. But for me, it's trying to figure out, when I'm struggling emotionally, what is going to facilitate positive change. Which is not the way that it's not everybody's way into it, but yeah.
Yeah, so I was having this conversation. Oh, sorry. Cecilia,
no worries.
really quickly, I was asking this question of like a colleague friend of mine, and just like getting her intuitions, and she was saying something like, her response reminded me of the thing you just said, which is that, like, because she cares so much about the end goal, she'll sometimes put herself in context in which she, for instance, consumes content she wouldn't otherwise consume, because it like makes her more hopeful and kind of like defeats like the despair.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if that's, I don't know how like actionable this is, or if this is just something that's like too context sensitive. Like for some people's personalities, that's maybe what you should do. For others, maybe not. But then does that mean that those ethics instructors who are a bit more dispositionally like myself are going to be creating and fostering classroom environments that are despairing environments that keep students from changing the world? And what do we do about that?
Yeah. Interesting. So of course, in my classroom, I'm doing a whole bunch of things simultaneously. So I'm implementing hope theory. We're starting with small, manageable goals. We're able to engage with the large despair, but we're also able to see ways in which things have changed in positive ways. And one of the ways I made sense of this for myself, because of course I'm concerned about the welfare of future generations in like a super serious way. And it does make me, quite upset. And what I need for hope, so this is one example that I've used before. There's some forms of hope where we end climate change. Jazz hands. There's other forms of hope where, like, even if it's time for humans to kick the bucket, we're decent to each other. We don't take down extra species with us. Like, that to me is a legitimate hope. It's not the cheeriest maybe, but like for my level of hope to be greater than zero, I'm hoping that humans are more decent to each other as we're facing these changes. And I think, and this is the tricky bit with imagination, right? Like, unless you act hopefully, the future is going to be dismal. There's a very good chance that it's going to be dismal, short of some like weird intervention from somewhere. I was going to stop there. I was just like blathering on. What are you thinking?
So Eric had a question, but I actually also had a question that I think it might be helpful for like continuing our discussion here. It's a question, clarificatory question. It's a clarificatory question which connects with actually Mercy's commentary that she gave. So it seemed like you have this way in which you're conceiving emotions to be structured, right? Which is different from the kind of like emotion reason structuring that you're thinking about. And Mercy kind of talked about this when she made her suggestion that, hey, look, what about desire, that desire component, right? Maybe we shouldn't think too much about the truth value kind of components, right, of emotions. So maybe we should shift considerations. And when your response to her, it seemed that maybe perhaps you guys might be talking past each other to a certain extent. And that could be because exactly how you're conceiving, right, this relationship between emotions and reason. And like, I know that you believe that emotions are cognitive, right? But exactly what?
Oh, I'm not
okay,
even.
so this is,
no.
Okay, so this is like exactly what that means.
But yes.
Yeah, so if you could tell us a little bit about like how you're conceiving this, like, so this is about like moral psychology of emotions, right? It's like how does emotions actually, like, how is it metaphysically structured, psychologically structured, so that like when we think about, right, how to educate emotions, right, we have to think about like how exactly does that work, right, in terms of like, you know, functionally and like psychologically, and like how beliefs can be integrated or how they wouldn't be integrated. And you could give like a, you know, there's a developmental process, right? So like children of a certain age might be educated differently, right, than children who are older. And that might depend on the way you understand emotional development to occur. But if you can tell us a little bit more about this, I think this would be really helpful in getting I think a better grasp of like maybe also on how you're thinking hope might work.
Okay, if you could synthesize that, what would be the first thing that you'd want me to respond to?
Just how do you imagine the structure of motion in terms of how, and you could specify like, here's, I don't know about emotions in general, right, because that's like huge, but like here's how I see the structure of hope working and how reason might be integrated, right? And are you thinking of that integration as a reason, emotion, still distinct, working together in conjunction? Or is it like in the hope itself, you have reason, right? Because you said you're not a cognitivist.
Well, I'm not anti. I recognize there are cognitive elements to emotions, but I don't want to reduce my view to one where all emotions have cognitive elements. That's going to leave way too much out of the picture. In terms of my thinking about emotion, and yes, it's too big. I go out of my way not to define emotion, but at the beginning of the book, I'm talking in broad ways about emotion. And then I don't zero in until chapter 4 on hope. And what I'm talking about with, and this is part of the slippage, I think, I transitioned my focus to hope as an emotion, and then I drilled down with hope. And now I'm thinking through the lens that Charles Taylor's work offered for hope as an emotion in a context. And I can't, and this is tricky, right? Like different emotions, different classrooms, different responses, different kids. It's I shouldn't say kids, young adults. It's you're always faced with these differences. But in terms of us understanding emotion in the classroom, I think we need to do it on a like piece by piece basis, right? So like, I'm going to talk about hope for a while. Would you like to talk about something else? Would you like, it's not, we're not, I don't think, I can't provide. I would be very impressed if somebody could, you know, a tome that's like, here are all the emotions that might surface in class, and here's the best way to respond, because then you've got context too, and like has already been brought up, the dynamics between the professor and the students. And for me, this is just tangential. I think being authentic with your students, like you being you and being honest about why you're doing what you're doing, like that's going to make for the best class. Meeting your students where you're at, human to human. And you can't do that if you're putting on a smiley face and you're not feeling hopeful. But then I would suggest being very specific about what you're hoping for, because it's easy to become hopeless when you have big hopes about big bad things. But if you have smaller hopes that are moving in the right direction, that's where we really see it growing. And yeah. So I think hope is one emotion. And I think that I'm thinking about hope through the structure of Charles Snyder's work, which is not perfect, right? I'm going to use this psychologist who's done a lot of work on hope. People disagree with Charles, but it's also widely accepted.
Can you tell us a little bit more about exactly Charles?
Sure.
For those who might not be familiar with the work and so on. Just
yeah,
and
like Rachel, the fact that you said you haven't got through the book, I hurt you so much that you've gotten through some of the book. So no need for apologies. So yeah, Charles Snyder's view is one where he is looking to use positive psychology to identify folks who are high hopers and use that to build off of in terms of how you cultivate hope. So specifically using a positive psychology approach. And what he saw with high hopers is a tendency to read the world as it is, hence me saying justified, you need to map the world. So describe the world as it is, have a plan for what you would like to do, keep it small and reasonable, and build off that. That's all Charles Snyder. And I don't know for every emotion that that's necessarily something that is going to take that shape or form. But Snyder is thinking of it along the lines of, I'm just going to assess, this 1,000 people about how they hope, and for high hopers, what's going on, and for low hopers, what's going on, and charting all of the differences. And, just because there's a correlation doesn't mean it's causation. But there is a lot of evidence, right, suggesting that if you're in this despair mode, you're not going to be very effective at identifying what's going on or acting in the world. And if you're in this more, and when I'm thinking of hope, it's like above zero, right? I'm not saying you have to be fireworks and flowers and everything's so wonderful. But that little bit of hope can really be a ground. Sorry, Liz, you've been waiting so patiently. Thank you for that.
No, I just wanted to add to sort of develop that argument ever so slightly. Years ago, I read Margaret Urban Walker's book on moral repair, and there's a chapter in there about hope. And you could sort of get rid of the rest of the book, but it's great too. But for our purposes, for her conception of hope is, it involves even looking for a goal that might be satisfying. So it's even keeping your eyes out for the possibility that there might be a goal on the horizon that would be worth pursuing counts as a hope. And I think that's relevant to what you said in the context of the Anthropocene, maybe we could kill fewer things, right? to start.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Go introduce one. I'm so upset that my computer died or my internet crashed at that moment, because I'm really curious about this conversation. But I want to tease apart two issues that I feel like are getting run together. And one has to do with the belief in the possibility of the desired outcome. And the other is, so I agree, and I think everyone in the standard hope literature agrees that to hope, you have to believe in the very possibility of the desired outcome. If you don't have any belief in the possibility of that outcome, you're not hoping. And similarly, if you're certain that the outcome will happen, you're not hoping either. So I think everyone's on board with that part.
Can I ask a quick question about that part?
Yeah.
Because I've gotten stuck there before. There's a book, I can't remember the name of the author, content warning, they were raped. And they were writing about their experience of building hope after. And what they said was, I had to trust in the hope of my partner and my child to even begin on the path that would eventually lead to her having hope. So it was like this way of saying, I don't have hope, but I have belief in the possibility if I track it through these people I trust, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, please continue with your second point.
I don't think it's sufficient. That alone is insufficient. I think you can be hopeless and still have belief in the possibility of a desired outcome and a desired outcome. But it might be necessary, not fully necessary, or not it might be necessary plus something else.
Yeah, not sufficient, necessary, but not
necessary condition. Yeah. So I agree with that part, but the part but I think sometimes you make it, you say things in response to my worry that we're defining hope in such a way that it doesn't permit for unjustified beliefs by saying something like, oh no, the hope is to have some belief in the possibility of the outcome. But I agree with that, to hope is to have some degree of belief in the possibility of the outcome. I agree with that. I just think that even with that, you can still have some belief in the possibility of the outcome and not be justified, because that belief itself isn't justified, but where it still seems like you're hoping. So for instance, like people in the mid 1800s might have had some degree of belief that the outcome of curing cancer was possible, and they really desired to cure cancer. But they might have been unjustified for some other reason. And the other reason might have been that they just there hadn't been sufficient scientific advancements, for instance, to give them justification in the belief. They still have the belief, it's just an unjustified belief.
And I think part of the strength of that concern lies in the fact that you're talking about folks who've been historically oppressed. Like, we have to worry about folks who've been historically oppressed and talking about hopefulness or the ability to hope, right? When I mean, the way I say it to my students is, some people from the get-go get life handed to them on a platter. Other people are fighting from day one, right? But before I go too far down any road, I wanted to ask what your working definition of hope was, in part because the thing that you're calling hope absent justification, there's two ways to get into it. One way is to say, okay, right now it might not be justified, but the actions that you're doing will make it justifiable. So it's that piecemeal, right? And another way is to just call it wishful thinking, right? When there's not a likelihood of an outcome, like I wish
There's
that this
a likelihood of an outcome, and you have a true belief that there's a likelihood of the outcome. There is a likelihood of an outcome, and you believe there's a likelihood of an outcome. You're just not justified in your belief of the likelihood of the outcome.
Okay, so you don't want to say wish, you want to have the emotional,
I just think that it captures the natural intuition that we can hope for things, even when we're unjustified in forming the belief in the possibility of the desired outcomes. That's all I'm trying to capture.
Yeah. And I
think prison abolitionists might really be hoping to abolish prisons, even if the details aren't currently sufficiently worked out enough how we're going to get there, such that we can say that their belief in the possibility of the outcome is justified. I think they might still be hoping. I think that's this interesting feature of hope where it can kind of run past the evidence in a way that inspires change, even when the present evidence doesn't even justify it, which is so I think it's kind of a beautiful feature of hope, that it has that potential, if I'm right that it does.
And again, I really do think, and Cecilia, you mentioned this, I think we are talking past each other, in that I could say, okay, so there's hope J, for justified hope. And then there's like rando hope that people have, whether something's going to happen or not. And they both have an H. So we're both referring. So different variants on hope is one way you might suggest a workaround. Because I'm not so hung up on your intuition that, because we do talk about it that way. I'm sure I talk about it that way, right? Like I really hope, blah, 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 blah. But there's this like more intentional sort of like I've grappled with this and I'm present with my emotional stance in the situation rather than a sort of like glib, wouldn't that be nice? But yeah, do you think that just by changing the definition, that could probably do a lot of work?
Like, okay, I guess what Kretz should say here is, I mean, call it what you want. I also don't care about the language. Maybe Kretz isn't concerned ultimately with hope, that maybe they're ultimately concerned with like rational hope or justified hope, call it whatever you want, just stipulate.
Right.
And that's when I was like, but wait a minute, if you're going to then do that, where you're interested in the rationality of the belief part, and I guess I could have done this before. I could have just like set aside the first bit that I did. I really could have, but I was just curious to hear what you, a bit about your view on the nature of what it is to hope proper. But then, what I was thinking was, well, once you're going in the direction of asking about the rationality of the belief part, why not just think about like the rationality of the desire part? And in fact, like, I know that sounds like jargony and abstract, but like, I think, so my parents are Trump supporters. And I think if I came to them and I was like, hey guys, look, I just read a book. And in this book, the person is telling us that like what ethics instructors should do is they should teach their students to be hopeful. My parents would be terrified because they'd be like, oh, I know what that means. What that means is you're going to teach them how to have your hopes, right? How to have your particular desires. And that's kind of what led me to think a bit about that desire side and the justification and like I don't know how you want to cash it out. And it's tricky because I don't want to like a sort of like robust moral realism in cashing it out. But like there does seem to be a sense in which like we can make mistakes in our desires. Like some desires do strike me as better and worse than others. And I feel like we need to be able to talk about that. And so what I was wondering is if we're talking about like mistakes with respect to the belief side of the hope, let's also talk about mistakes with respect to the desire side of hope. And
can you give an
how
example?
How do we as instructors deal with those mistakes?
Yeah, can you give an example of what you're thinking of the desire side of hope and it being like nefarious hopes? You're just circling back to nefarious hopes, right? In a different way.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Like, what if someone wants to outlaw? I have a student who, wants to outlaw gay marriage or wants to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I think, oh, they have a desire there or a hope there, but it's for the wrong thing.
Well, according to you, according to me, right? According to some folks. And I'm always starting with the assumption that whatever behavior students are going to engage in, they're anti-oppressive behaviors. They're not perpetuating oppression. I think we're at a point as humans that we can say the logic of domination, oppressing others, is not the most ethical way to interact. So I feel like just giving the qualification, your actions need to in some way help alleviate oppression. And you can get into I've had all these debates, right? Like, according to my view, this is actually fighting oppression because oppression is this and da 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 da. And I've loved having these conversations. And I'll be honest with you, I've been helping students with ideas and that I have zero personal investment in, and if anything, a tendency to have a strong negative response to. And that's been part of my learning, right? Is having these relationships with students, meeting them where they're at, and me stopping thinking I've got it all figured out. And literally just, students are going to make mistakes in class with their desire, with their rational hope, or like we're all going to make mistakes as long as we're growing from them.
I think a lot of philosophers won't like that response, but I'm a philosopher who likes that response.
Can I interject though here? So I like where this is going, but I'm a little bit concerned about maintaining this belief desire structure of emotions and hope, right? Because
enough,
we
fair
can say,
enough.
hey, look, what you really are talking about are the motivational features of hope, which
Right.
may not have anything to do with desire, right? Like desire and beliefs about possibilities may be in the background, but there's a unique motivational aspect of hope that goes beyond desire and beliefs. And this is kind of why we want to say sometimes that, like, it's in the face of impossibilities, right? Where we need things that we think are just impossible, but they have to be the case. Like injustices have to be corrected, right? And even if we think it's impossible to do that, right? It's like, okay, here's where we need hope, right? And desire and like beliefs might not be really the right kind of thing necessarily that we would be focusing on when we're talking about that motivational feature of hope. Right? Because like desire, you can desire things, but that's not necessarily motivating.
Yeah, and once and this isn't a distinction that I do in my own work, but or I don't routinely do it. I've often thought about this because it's in the literature, but you've got belief and you've got desire, and these are separated. Whereas for me, in the context of hope, that's part of the virtue of hope, without going down a full virtue analysis. That's part of the strength of hope, is that it is capable of getting us into the action, right? And I'm going to read to you what I wrote down. I don't know if it helps at all, but when I hear desire, and this is going to open a whole can of words, but desire is in the realm of emotion, right? To have a desire is treading on that territory, right? Of wanting one thing over another. So you're valuing one thing over another. And when I think about bridge between theory and action, it's motivation. But I think that, oh, I love that there's that dog. I think that emotional bridges like hope, like sympathy, like empathy, are all motivating, right? I find them all to be motivating in being in the world in ways that are more kind, just, and humane. Yeah, I don't know if that says anything, but I'm hesitant to start making conceptual distinctions and like attaching myself to like, what's your stance on the belief desire relationship? And I'm gonna stop talking there. Who's next? Oh gosh.
I had it's very helpful. I don't know, I haven't done research on hope or just the way that it's been described.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Eric, but you're going in and out. I'm wondering if you turn off your picture, we could hear your words. And right from the start.
So yeah. So my thought in your exchange between Mercy and yourself, and thinking about, what do we do when we as teachers have despair when we're teaching about environmental ethics, climate change, those sorts of things. And, you talked about, having smaller hopes, that hope, maybe focusing on some positive news stories, like there's small things that, engineers are doing that are, reducing carbon footprint, those sorts of things. And, the way you set it up in the book, it seems like despair and hope are sort of these opposites, but it seems like they're just super close together at the same time, because despair, it's like, okay, you have this belief that you have zero chance of reaching this goal, whereas hope, it might be like, oh, we've got this 1%, we got a sliver of opportunity here to solve climate change or something like that. And so, yeah, so it seems like maybe all you need is just a little bump in this direction, some glimmer of hope, so to speak, to get you from despair as a teacher to hope. And then there's this question that might even labor this discussion even further about the importance of like justified hope versus hope that doesn't have a justified belief, because maybe if you think that you only have hope if you've got a justified belief, well, now maybe that really careful sliver between despair and hope is a little wider now, because just because you saw that one positive news, that really justification to believe that we're going to solve climate change or something like that. And so I don't know if any of this is helpful in sort of continuing the discussion that's been going on about wishful thinking versus hope versus like a justified hope and all of that. But anyway.
I'm learning so much about myself and my view right now. I can't even begin to tell you. I'm like, oh, I got this submerged premise, and oh, I'm assuming this, so yeah, this question of we as teachers having despair, I would actually, as a teacher, do what the hope literature says. I would find other teachers who are concerned. If there were no teachers concerned, I go find some folks who are concerned. If there aren't folks who are concerned, I make a group. I send out a call and be like, okay, this is my response. I'm in despair. I would like to have a community to share that experience with. And like in virtue of having that conversation, I would say the sliver is very likely to open, right? Because you're with other human beings who care about the same thing, and they're willing enough to meet, right? To talk about it, and that's already in the direction of action, at least on my reading. So I mean, I've done this in actuality. I'll tell you a quick story, and then I'll stop because I want to be mindful of time. We're probably already going over. But part of it is training yourself, right? How am I going to be the best teacher that I can be? Well, one dimension is, doing my PhD. Another dimension might be like learning what my emotions are, how they're acting in the classroom. Like that might be something else. But the story I was going to tell real quick was the reason Scholars for Syria started, I think I mentioned it in the book, which is a very successful initiative. It was a university-wide initiative. We had multiple Syrian refugees involved in it. And I think that took off that way because a student came into my class and said, my heart is broken. I saw the picture of this kid and I don't understand why we're not doing better. Like, I don't get it. And was very distraught. And I was like, you have to find a group and meet with that group and build on that and da-da-da-da-da. And I went home and there was nothing local. I did my own Google search. There was nothing local. So the next day I met with the student. I'm like, okay, we're gonna have to do a call out. So we did a call out, a university-wide call out. Lo and behold, there were all these little factions on campus very interested and already working in some ways, but not in conversation with each other. So like the group grew, and then the stuff that's come out of that, like I can't even begin to tell you, a not-for-profit, publications, like blah, blah, blah. It's a good story. It has a positive ending, but I also think like that's the work, right? I'm feeling hopeless and I don't even see a group in the world that's working on it. Okay, how do I make a group? And for me, this is just personal. I push myself because I know the emotional space I want to live in, right? And that's not to undermine the importance of having that very negative response. That's very important information. And I have to be careful about not wanting to grasp onto some things and, avoid others. But I do think if you're willing to take those steps, you as a teacher can support yourself with regard to growing hope in initiatives that are meaningful to you, the things that make you despair, what you can do in another direction.
I have a question though.
You go, Liz. I've taken up enough space.
Oh, well, we can both say our questions and then Leaf can decide which direction she wants to go in, or they want to go in, pardon me. Thank you. So I work for an organization that studies how to do character education. And so much of what you said sounds very close to that, because developing emotional capacities feels very much like developing character capacities. But I'd just like to hear but also that's controversial for a lot of reasons. So I just love to hear your thoughts on how you feel that your work, how you situate your work in relationship to character education.
Gotcha. Thank you. Oh, are we hearing both questions or not?
I can hold on to mine. I also have Liz's question, so I'm glad you bring this
We have
up.
20 minutes, so I think we have.
Oh, we do have time. I was going to say,
Yeah.
Cecilia, I should. Okay, good deal. Okay, I'll start with this one. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Nancy Snow. I'm a Nancy Snow fan, and they're implementing character education in various high schools. So my exposure is through Nancy and Nancy's work. So I don't know if that's the sort of work that you have in mind. I feel like there's a difference in that character education has X, Y, and Z, and you need to feel X, Y, and Z at times 1, 2, and 3, and then you'll be good. Whereas what I'm trying to come up with is something where it's not you need to get to a certain point, but you need to engage in a process that will help you become a more ethical person by reflecting, by knowing your emotional states, by knowing what's required to act in the world and what sort of ingredients you need when you're in that space to be able to, if you can. And I make a clarification in the book, like there is like clinically depressed, and then there's I'm feeling depressed. And those are very different conversations. If you're clinically depressed, absolutely, immediately, you should be speaking with a therapist. And I think I said this, I don't think I cut the footnote. If you're just depressed, you should also go talk to a counselor. Like, this is a good time to figure out how to maintain health and well-being, even in challenging times. But it's less of a, you need to get to this place, I have the name of it, and I'm going to tell you how to feel. And I don't want to undermine the importance of character education. I think it can be incredibly fruitful, and goodness gracious, like all of the ideas. Let's use all of the ideas simultaneously and see what comes out of it. But yeah, with Nancy and the research that Nancy was doing, I was really impressed with how they were trying to cultivate it in the schools. And I gave an unfair description and like, here's the emotion, you have to feel it. You don't have to do character education that way. And that's part of my hang up in terms of how I've encountered virtue ethics earlier in my life. I do like virtue ethics. I just refuse to get tied down with any one view. I'm like, yeah, they're cool, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm doing a big mess. It's just a mess. Yeah, thank you for that. Do you have some ideas about how it is the same or different?
I think that your initial instinct of, or your worry that character education can say, well, this is the kind of person you need to become, somebody who feels this way, is an important critique for character educators to keep in mind. Because I do think there's always the danger in character education of sort of emotional coercion to say like, this is what it means to be a good person, and we can tell you who you ought to be. But I do think character education can adopt the or at least less coercive attitude of, we do think we can offer students certain practices that can give them opportunities to grow in certain ways if they want to take them. And I think what that raises is all kinds of important questions about what gets graded, what doesn't. What do students think is required to get a good recommendation letter and to be seen as cooperative, and so like I think we do have to look at power and ask, are we giving students opportunities for growth, or are we either punishing or shaming for their choice to engage or not engage? But I do think that it is true that there are some predictable ways to become more compassionate or more honest or more courageous or more hopeful, and that we should be willing to say, these are some predictable ways to grow this emotional capacity should you want to. And we're not doing our jobs if we don't help them identify those pathways. That's my
Can I actually interject here also in this conversation? So I think one thing that's really, really important to acknowledge, especially when we talk about the difference between just like emotion education broadly construed and then character education, right? Is that like character education seems more culturally laden, right? So you might be able to take this like interpretation of emotional expressions and so on and so forth broadly if you don't think of it in terms of character education, right? Then you might be able to say, hey, look, I can acknowledge all different kinds of cultural ways of understanding, like, for example, shame, right? But then when you start thinking about, well, how do we get into character education? And especially I think like, you know, not only because shame is one of my favorite subjects, but if you think about the different ways in which shame kind of can be related to like in the aspect of character education, right? Some people will say, no, shame is like not, you don't want to use shame in character, right? It's a bad thing. And some people might say like, no, actually it's a good thing. It's important. And that those decisions might be very culturally laden, right? And here, so I'm going to connect this now with Eric's commentary, right? So one thing that Eric's commentary kind of made me think of is, especially with his suggestion of like the division of labor, right? I was thinking like, well, I'm wondering, you know, maybe it's just kind of part of what Eric was getting at was like, you're just asking so much of an educator, right? Because now if we're thinking, right, like, okay, we don't have the cultural like scaffolding, right, to give us constraints for educators to be able to like practically, right, like navigate the whole landfill of like culturally different emotional experiences, right? Then you're like, oh crap, right? Like now, like in order to, I mean, I already have problems dealing with like learning all the new technology and stuff. Right. So now it's like, oh my gosh, now every educator has to be like an expert in emotion, which I think is great. But I'm like, that seems like a almost like an impossible task that we're placing on educators.
Yeah, I guess, and this is not to minimize your claim. I was reading curriculum recently. Our tasks are impossible. They're always impossible. We have impossible jobs. We will fail all day, every day, and be wonderful for trying, right? Like I'm speaking on I shouldn't say we, but I do think yes, we are tasked with impossible amounts of work to do. You know, the ways in which we're supposed to be able to, I won't even get started. Yes, impossible. And because this is added after the fact, and we've already had reason, like white male reason at the center, we've all learned how to do it that way. We're all comfortable with doing it that way. Eric, I remember you pointing out somewhere the number of page numbers in one of my assignments, and like the font's really, like I've been doing it for 10 years, and every time a student asks a question, I throw in an answer, right? So it's totally unwieldy. It's huge. But I don't want the difficulty of the work to detract from the fact that the current model is one that does not fit a lot of people. It's not, you know, safe for a lot of people, and calling into question the authority and the continuing dominance of that model. I'm as exhausted as the next person. Like I'm doing another degree. It's exhausting. There's a lot of work involved. And I think, you know, we choose as we're going along the sort of work we're going to nurture over time in our class, right? And even just, you know, writing down in the margins, are you having an emotional response to Descartes right now? Why are you having that emotional response? How's your day going? Have you had enough food? Is that making a difference? Or, you know, like just that basic awareness of emotion in the classroom, I think is a huge step. So I absolutely don't think it's, oh, this is terrible. I don't think it's reasonably for me to hope at this moment that all classes will take this seriously. However, with unfolding over time, I hope the situation, I can't even say it. In the future, I will have a justified hope, because you have to take those first small steps. But yeah, I wanted to also say thank you for bringing up power, Liz. Like, I think we always have to keep circling back to those questions of power. I mean, like, I wrote the book, you read about the demographics, like it's problematic what is getting represented, what's not getting represented. So that question of coercion applies in my case too, right? In the case of the book, like all of us might be coercive and we all have to be careful not to be, but emotions may be in a way that wouldn't be the same as with reason. Like they might be importantly different in their phenomenology. And I just really quickly wanted to say, I don't know if you're all familiar with ungrading. Jesse Stommel, Stommel, and you can email me at any point, has like a movement, like an ungrading movement. So if you're asking those questions about grading and its merits, I would encourage you to check out Jesse Stommel. I don't know that I would do it the way that Jesse does it, but I appreciate the fact that ungrading is catching on.
Great.
Rachel, were you first and then Eric, or Eric and then Rachel?
Eric and then Rachel.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of speak to the division of labor stuff, just because, you know, that was the center part of my commentary. And yeah, I think like the idea of, you know, a traditional ethics course, but with the instructor sort of at least acknowledging emotion somewhere along the way and doing small things, I think that's much more realistic. But you know, and so I like that your super long list at the end of the book is like 31 items or something. Some of them are very involved and some of them are very big steps for instructors to take. And I guess one point I want to just sort of highlight is that with the division of labor, if that sort of works, then you could set aside a course to do those very involved projects, and students get something out of those projects. And, you know, they might be carrying those ideas, those skills and things into other classes, including philosophy classes and stuff. And the idea of division of labor, you know, it's possible that we actually do more emotional stuff on the whole if we set aside a whole class for it, rather than doing, you know, I'm being crude, but you know, 20% emotion stuff, 80% moral reasoning or something like that. And you know, and the idea of yeah, I think that skills that we learn in a class can be brought into other classes. And you know, if the teacher is not very aware of emotions and things like that, and they present students with a bunch of depressing topics, well, they might have at least the starts of skills to be exercising those. Those are opportunities to exercise your hopefulness and to, you know, create, you know, reframe your thinking, or to, you know, set goals and things like that. So yeah, so it just seems like, you know, some of the things would be really easy for everybody to implement, but then there's a question of whether these big projects are really worth it. And if they are, then, you know, maybe it is worth trying to have a course dedicated to educating emotions, kind of like the University of Wyoming and, you know, the other stuff. So that was just my thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I should speak more because that was a big contribution. Let me see, where did I put my notes? Okay, so when you were talking about, I'll start with the small thing and then I'll get to the bigger piece. When you're talking about reason and emotion in the classroom and saying like 80% reason, 20% emotion, like I guess you can have like your headers on your slides or however you teach being like emotion, reason, emotion. But yeah, at the crux of this too is the reason emotion dualism, right? Like assuming that they're not simultaneously operating all the time together. But with regard to the division of labor, I'll be completely honest. When you brought up the University of Wyoming, I was like, damn, because I was like, I remember thinking, I was like, worst case scenario, you introduce a class, right? It's better than nothing. And you're like, the better than nothing, let's run with it. And I'm like, no. But yes, I do think your question's very legitimate in terms of what's going to be most effective, what's most going to help our students, who is best positioned to teach this. Absolutely. I would make the case though, anyone who's educating as an ethics instructor right now in philosophy, right? It's a question you need to be asking. whether you can do a little bit more for the reasons I hope that were persuasive outlined in the book. I feel like who is next? Did I miss somebody?
Rachel?
Rachel.
Yeah, I did
Celia,
have a
can you take
question.
over?
Sorry, what?
No, I'm just saying I'm doing a lousy job at answering my own questions. I said, Cecilia, maybe you should take over.
No, it's great. So I want to ask a question, maybe of everybody who has done any amount of, emotional education in their classrooms, because I certainly have done some, and I'm guessing everybody has done some if they've, been a part of this now. And if we're thinking back to Murphy's point about, the belief component of hope and the desire component, or because of what Cecilia suggested, maybe the desire / motivational component, whatever we want to call that metaphysically, I think we have a lot of reason to focus more attention on that motivational component and evaluating that part of students' emotional experiences, because at least in my classrooms, students have had a lot of practice evaluating beliefs to see whether they're true or false or justified or not. Like, that is not an unfamiliar task. But I kind of think as educators, our job is to give our students valuable experiences that they're not likely to get otherwise. And a lot of other classes are not going to teach about evaluating our own motivations and our own desires. So with that in mind, I just wanted to ask you all, do you have like particularly good strategies for engaging with evaluation of that motivational or desiring component of students' emotions, rather than just like the belief justification part?
Is anybody writing about this?
Can I just like ask a clarificatory question of the question first? Like, so are you talking about the relationship between like how belief and motivation can work together for like emotions to be motivated? Or when you're talking about like the motivational component, can you give us like a little bit more in terms of what you might be thinking?
I meant something more like, let's say we've gone through some steps and we've identified what our own emotions are. We've maybe even identified what other people's emotions are. And then maybe we're seeing a conflict there. And often that conflict is because people want different things. Sometimes it's because they have different beliefs, but often it's because they want different things or they're motivated to pursue different goals. And so I think ethics education probably has to engage with, okay, when we want different things, who's got the better wants, or who's got at least acceptable wants? Because I want to countenance a lot of wants, but some of them I'm going to say aren't acceptable, like oppressive wants. And other kinds of wants are not. Okay, and some are just harmful to the person who has them, whether they realize it or not. So like, I think that part, evaluating, are these the wants? Are these the goals that we should be pursuing? That's the part I'm trying to like draw our attention to, and like, how can we help students engage with that? Does that help, Cecilia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of like the nefarious like values kind of comment that Mercy was bringing up, but it, like you're thinking more so as like, like racially motivated like desires, right? Or like think like you might say certain controversial desires and motivations might be like they're controversial, but we're not really sure, right? Because like in a pluralistic kind of society, you might just say, okay, let's just let pluralism and dialogue and debate like work things out, right? But then you could also have like people who just have like no one except for these people, like it's just bad, right? Like their desire to like want to eliminate, certain minorities or so on. So it's just, that's just bad, right? And like, what
like
about?
Those are extreme cases, but there are like maybe much less extreme cases. Like I've written about, I think competitive exclusionary desires are bad. Like I think they're bad desires to have. That's an incredibly minority position in the United States. But like I think there's an argument to be made, and there's millions of other arguments about different kinds of desires that are like not good to have for one reason or other. Students don't have a lot of practice talking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like, or even like lots of students come in with maybe some like unreflective bourgeois preferences that you might be like, that seems, the fact that you feel that comfortable consuming that much and that seems to you a desirable lifestyle might be bad, if you will.
I was just really quickly going to say, I hope that framing it as, and it's not uncontroversial, but framing it as anti-oppressive, you'll be able to tell which desires are problematic. Because if it involves, dominating others and oppressing others and keeping systems of domination in place, then that's not going to be a desire that's in the direction of more inclusivity, diversity.
So this is your non-value neutrality speaking here, right? Because you're like, no, I'm not being value neutral. I actually do have values that I want to promote, but that's like diversity, inclusiveness, right? Justice, so on. So like we can navigate.
I feel like that's sort of like the claim that, nothing is true except the claim that nothing is true. Like you're always going to find an example. But what does that show? But yes, absolutely. Yes. And I haven't had any, knock on wood, hate mail yet saying like, how dare you force anti-oppression onto the children? Liberal, no, obviously I am, but I'm really trying to facilitate students having their experience, validating them in important ways, giving them when I started teaching philosophy, I was all about the content, and I had a mentor pull me over and say, like, drop the content. Just have a whole class without content. Just like you are teaching a philosophical process. It's a way of engaging with material. It's a way of engaging with the world. They're not going to remember the content. They will remember the discussion and how you got there. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think so. We're out of time, but one last thing is I think this is really interesting because it now takes us into, like going beyond is the political questions, right? Which I think are really important to engage as well. So thank you, everyone, Leaf and Eric and Elizabeth and Mercy and Rachel as well. This was like a wonderful. Thank you. This is a wonderful session. Like I could totally continue this discussion. So I'm going to stop recording now.